This boy woke up in the worst situation imaginable. He was trapped inside a truck packed with zombie monsters. After being brutally beaten, he found himself in a strange place. In reality, this man was a living legend of the military. He could take on hundreds of soldiers by himself, but during a mission, he was betrayed by his own comrades. Now he has been reincarnated as Mikio, a boy who was beaten and forced to work. But things are about to change. Mikio is a monster in military combat, capable of defeating an entire army on his own. A helicopter soared through the sky, carrying the Republic of Andermia's elite special forces. They were feared by soldiers and terrorist organizations all over the world. Among the world's greatest special forces unit, there was one man known as the strongest. George Tsiolkas stood there with his G6 rifle in hand. Without a shred of mercy, he eliminated his enemies like a machine. Everyone revered him as the god of war. But on the 6th of July 2025, the strongest man fell on the battlefield during an operation to eliminate the terrorist group Ignition. The soldiers, he reported that the helicopter had become unstable due to strong winds. They were changing the drop point, but Captain Ghost believed the surprise attack would be ruined. If they continued like this, half the squad would die. He insisted they stick to the original plan, but George grabbed a rope and Beck demanded to know what he was doing. George announced that he would go ahead, and they could meet him at Point B. Beck shouted for him to wait, but the god of war rappelled down the rope and landed safely without a scratch. Then he calmly looked ahead. Beck asked if they could turn back, but the soldier said it was impossible. They would proceed to Point B, and told George not to throw his life away. The soldier kept moving forward until a laser sight landed on his head. A sniper fired. George instantly spun around, using a statue as cover to block the bullet before preparing to counterattack. He moved out of cover. He aimed his weapon and shot the sniper in the head and arm. The soldier fell from the top of the building, but another gun was suddenly pressed against the back of George's head. He turned around, but the assassin warned him not to move. Just as the man was about to pull the trigger, George drove his elbow into the man's forearm, knocking the shot off target. He swept the man's legs out from under him, then slipped behind him and locked him in a chokehold. From behind, he finished him off by snapping his neck. George glanced to the side, and realized they were still there. The assassins continued firing at him relentlessly. George moved forward, using another mercenary as a human shield. He remarked that this was quite a rude welcome. He raised his gun and took aim. He unleashed a relentless barrage, killing everyone in front of him. Beck shouted for George to answer if he was still alive. He called out again, as George picked up the radio and headed toward the gate. Elsewhere, at Point B, a soldier reported that the breach preparations were complete and asked about George, but Beck said there had been no response, and that George was just too eager to get himself killed. The door suddenly swung open. Everyone turned around with their weapons raised, but Beck was stunned. George reported that the mansion had been secured, and that he would leave gathering the intelligence to them. The soldiers outside let out sighs of relief. They commented that he had actually pulled it off. He truly was a monster. They called him the god of war, but Beck called out to George. He demanded to know why George had acted alone, saying that anyone who disobeyed orders was useless to the team. George replied that the mission had been a success. Besides, if they had forced the operation under those circumstances, the entire unit could have been wiped out. Beck scoffed and told him not to argue back. One of the soldiers stood at attention and reported that the commander-in-chief was calling Captain Jack. Jack muttered that the brat must be causing trouble again, but George told him not to misunderstand. He had only done it to repay a favor. After all they had to do was eliminate the enemy and secure victory. It wasn't because he wanted to rebel, but because he had a purpose. After thinking it over for a moment, Beck turned away and told the kid to go get himself killed. He said he was heading back to headquarters, and that George should simply follow orders from now on. George asked what mission he had just been assigned. Then he asked what those orders actually were, but everyone pointed their weapons at him. George asked what this was supposed to mean. The soldiers apologized, saying they were only following Beck's orders. The protagonist thought it over. He reached for the weapon at his waist, but they opened fire and shot him in the head. George thought about Beck's orders and wondered what they truly meant. Did it mean Beck had planned to kill him from the very beginning? But then a blonde woman said, "George, come back safely." It was Sophia. Suddenly, the protagonist woke up and wondered what that sound was. He could even smell death. A zombie stood right in front of him. He got to his feet, wondering what had happened. He was certain he had been on the mission to eliminate Ignition. The truck's cargo door swung open, dumping all the corpses into the sea. George fell out and thought this was bad. The scaffolding collapsed, and he began falling with it, but he grabbed onto a ledge and barely saved himself. He panted heavily. His adrenaline was surging. George climbed back up, thinking how close that had been. There were an unbelievable number of corpses, and the stench was unbearable. Is this the front line of the strange zone? He wondered. Two men talked about taking out the trash early in the morning, saying it was nothing more than feeding the fish in Tokyo Bay. George overheard them and wondered what they meant. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew off his blindfold. George repeated, "Japan, my homeland." So, on the 6th of July 2026, George had died and been reincarnated on an island of utter despair, the worst hell he had ever experienced. George wondered what the hell was going on. He thought he had been in the Middle East. How did he end up in Tokyo Bay? He turned back, trying to piece together the clues. It was just a truck. He kept walking until he reached a forest. He let out a sigh after walking for so long. George felt like he was struggling to breathe. He wondered what had happened to his body, so he kept moving. He figured he needed to find food and water first. He snapped a vine in half, and water flowed out. He drank from it beneath a tall tree. He reflected that it reminded him of the time he got separated from his squad in the forest. But then he noticed something different. There was a small town on the outskirts. George continued walking through the area. He figured this place must be somewhere around Tokyo Bay. He stepped on a used tube of toothpaste, thinking that such filth shouldn't exist in Japan. But something else caught his attention. He looked into a piece of broken glass, and realized it wasn't his own face. It belonged to someone else. Then someone grabbed his shoulder and called him Mikio. George reacted instantly, locking the man in a chokehold. The young man asked what was wrong, saying, "It's me, Masa." The protagonist wondered if the man knew him. Since the man appeared to be unarmed, George let him go. He realized his name was now Mikio. Masa asked why he had suddenly done that. Mikio asked what he wanted. The young man replied that he was his friend. Mikio understood and reached out his hand in apology. Masa shook it. He said he was relieved to see Mikio was all right and had been worried, especially after seeing him beaten so badly. Mikio asked, "I was beaten? Why?" Masa explained that in this mining camp, Ja's word was law, and that's why. Just then, Ja appeared and demanded to know what he had just called him, especially since a lowly slave on his team dared to speak to him without using honorifics. Now he would be punished. Ja raised his fist and punched the young man. The boy fell near the broken mirror. Ja sneered that he was an idiot for forgetting the rules, and if you forget them, you'll be punished. If you anger me, you'll be the one who pays the price. Masa apologized, saying it was his fault, because Mikio had addressed him without using honorifics. I was only dragged into this because of him. Ja turned toward George, and said it was surprising that he had survived such a brutal beating, but the protagonist didn't react. He simply stared at him. Ja demanded to know what that look meant. It seemed he still hadn't been beaten enough. George remained silent without reacting. Ja said that smug expression was about to earn him another punishment. He threw a punch, but George dodged it, thinking it was far too obvious. His opponent was nothing but an amateur. George declared that he had no interest in attacking civilians, but if Ja insisted on fighting, he would take control of the situation. He ducked under another punch as Ja shouted for him to shut up. George drove his fist into Ja's face. Ja's consciousness began to fade, but he somehow managed to stay on his feet. He cursed and grew even more furious. George thought he had landed a solid counterattack, but the man still didn't go down. This body is weaker than I expected. Even so, he advanced toward Ja. Ja tried to attack with another punch. The protagonist leaped into the air, thinking that even with this frail body, his elbow strike would be powerful enough to take the man down. He slammed his elbow into Ja's chin. Ja staggered in pain, then collapsed to the ground. George told him he couldn't win. He should go pick a fight somewhere else unless he wanted to die. George then turned to leave. Ja said he had underestimated him and pulled something from his jacket. It was a knife. He declared that anyone who resisted would receive 100-fold punishment. George immediately turned around, but a child stepped in front of him, shouting that it was too dangerous. Ja charged forward with the knife. The boy shut his eyes in fear, but the protagonist moved first. He grabbed Ja's knife-wielding arm. He warned Ja that once a weapon was drawn, he had to be prepared either to kill or to be killed. He struck Ja's neck with a decisive blow, then used a leg sweep to slam him to the ground. After that, he pinned him down. The little boy screamed in terror, unable to believe what was happening. Ja coughed as pain ravaged his body, but his fear quickly overwhelmed him. The protagonist raised his fist. Ja desperately cried out, begging George to stop and wait. But the protagonist said, "Those aren't the words you say, in a fight to the death." Then he put all his strength into a punch and smashed it into the man's face. The child stood there in shock. George got back to his feet. Ja lay unconscious on the ground. The protagonist realized he had put his entire body weight behind that punch, but it was the most damage he could deal. He needed to do something about this weak body first. The boy was bewildered by what he had witnessed. Then reality sank in, and he asked what had happened to Mikio. The protagonist looked back. He wondered who this child was, and why he looked so familiar. But the boy asked if he was joking. George replied that he had lost his memory. Q said, "It's me, the kid who lives next door." Mikio apologized, saying he couldn't even remember the boy's name. Q ran after him, asking if he had forgotten him too. Ja angrily shouted that this would bring him an enormous punishment. On the way home, Q commented that Mikio had been unbelievably strong, and that he wanted to learn how to fight too. George replied that more importantly, he wanted to know about this island. The boy said they had no other choice. This was the industrial waste island floating in Tokyo Bay. It was nothing but a filthy mountain of garbage. The protagonist thought he had never heard of such a place, and wondered if it really existed in Japan. The men were forced to work in the mines, while the women and children could only survive by selling things or scavenging through trash. Security was just as terrible as the rumors claimed. The island was one gigantic cesspool. George thought it looked like a post-war slum. Maybe it was even worse. Q spotted a loaf of bread on the table and began daydreaming about eating it. The shopkeeper told the kid to get lost, betting he didn't have any money. Q told him not to jump to conclusions. When the protagonist pulled out a bill, he asked to buy the loaf of bread. The shopkeeper agreed, and Q asked if he was really giving it to him. George said it was his way of thanking him for the information earlier. The boy thanked him, but wanted to know where he had gotten the money. The protagonist said it was loot from the fight earlier. He wouldn't stoop to taking money from the dead, but in a place like this, money was essential. Q said Mikio had become a completely different person. When he got home, he opened the door and announced he was back. Tonight they would celebrate with his mother because Mikio had bought this for them. The boy's mother told him he should eat too, but Q replied that he already had. His mother asked if he was sure, and the boy told her not to worry and to eat because she needed to keep up her strength. Suddenly, the protagonist caught a strange smell. He instinctively turned around. He slammed the door shut with a backward elbow strike. Q called out to him. The protagonist kept holding the door, while someone outside tried to force it open. Flames began engulfing the house. Q's mother started coughing. The soldiers were setting their house on fire. Ja declared that because of what Mikio had done, his punishment would be death. The two people inside were horrified. Q asked why this was happening. The protagonist kept trying to break the door open. He realized they had been locked in from the outside. It was an ambush. There had to be something useful in here. Then he found it. Anything in this house could become a weapon. He spotted a bag and thought, this is it. He grabbed the bag and headed for the door. Q called out to Mikio, asking what he was doing. The protagonist moved his feet with explosive speed. He kicked the door open, sending the thugs flying backward. All the miners shouted, "He's here!" Ja told them that the kid had come out. He called him an idiot, ordering everyone to surround him from all sides. The protagonist simply prepared himself for battle. He said, "So it's you again," and asked what the objective was this time. Ja scoffed and asked if it wasn't already obvious. For humiliating him, resisting him, and even injuring him, Mikio would pay with his life. The protagonist said he understood. From this moment on, every hostile threat would be eliminated. But Ja merely laughed and told him to stop being ridiculous. Q and his mother coughed from the smoke. They soon noticed the protagonist lowering his stance. He gestured with his finger, telling them to run as soon as they saw an opening. One of the miners charged with a knife, asking if he really thought they would let him escape, but the protagonist grabbed several small stones. The miner attacked with his knife, but was struck in the head as the protagonist dodged. Everyone was completely stunned. They wondered what he had just used. It was a sling, the weapon the protagonist had improvised. It was crudely made, from leather and small stones. Once swung to build momentum, it could inflict devastating damage on impact. Despite being simple to make, its power was terrifying. That made it a favorite weapon. Among elite assassins, a deadly tool, designed specifically to destroy the human body. Ja was completely shocked, as everyone else was defeated. George told him that he was the only one left. Ja said, "You're supposed to be just a kid." He charged forward, yelling at him to stop fooling around. However, the protagonist struck his arm with the sling. The man cried out, in agony as his arm snapped. The knife slipped from his hand. George walked toward him. Ja trembled in fear, but slowly looked up. He stared at the protagonist's cold, merciless expression. He begged George to wait, saying there would be no punishment anymore. But the protagonist replied, "Too late. Anyone who threatens your life doesn't deserve to see tomorrow. At that moment, Q wrapped his arms around the protagonist's waist and begged him to stop. The boy said he couldn't take that man's life. No matter how strong he was, killing someone was wrong. The boy shouted, begging him not to become a murderer. Ja took the opportunity to flee in terror. The protagonist spun his makeshift weapon, preparing to throw it while the boy held him back. He released the improvised weapon, but it struck a post beside Ja instead. The man looked back in horror. George wondered if he had really missed the throw. As Ja escaped, he groaned, in pain. Q thanked God for stopping his friend. The protagonist kept repeating the word murderer in his mind. Later, in a warehouse, Ja pleaded desperately. He begged for permission to punish Mikio. He claimed Mikio had attacked him and swung a weapon, like a madman who had lost his sanity. A blonde-haired man stood up and said such behavior was unforgivable. Ja agreed, but was suddenly punched in the face. The man replied that a local supervisor losing to a slave miner was utterly pathetic and deserved a beating severe enough to be an execution. Ja burst into tears, terrified that he was about to die from the brutal beating. The man pulled back his fist. He was wearing a pair of steel knuckles. He repeated Mikio's name and said it looked like that brat needed a few more beatings. Later, at another house, Q commented that the situation was truly awful. They had worked so hard to build that home, and it had been destroyed in an instant. He asked what they were going to do now. The boy's mother called out to Mikio, asking if he was really okay staying there. George agreed, but said it was only a deal to clear things up. In return, they would tell him how the island was governed, how the food distribution system worked, and everything else. Because he wanted to know it all. George grew frustrated by all of this. Q told him to calm down and stop talking like a stranger. Ever since losing his memory, he had been acting very strangely. They wondered if even his personality had changed. George repeated the words a different person in his mind, and thought the kid might be right. He used to be a soldier, but he had lost his life at the hands of his own comrades on the battlefield. There had to be something much bigger behind all of this. I won't let it end like this. I'll definitely escape this island, and I'll hunt down every last one of those traitors. The next day, he trained outside. He started doing push-ups, first with his left hand, then with his right. George wondered if this was really all the strength he had left. It felt like his muscles and core strength had to be rebuilt from scratch. A voice caught his attention. Masa approached his friend. The protagonist recognized him as the guy from before, the one who had turned him over to Ja. Masa asked what he was doing, saying he'd be late for work at the mine. The protagonist thought this was a good opportunity to gather information. Deep inside the mine, a foreman ordered everyone to line up. The workers gathered and formed a line. Two of them looked displeased when they saw Mikio. He figured they must have been Ja's lackeys. The director announced that he had important news today. Ja, the supervisor in charge of Team G, was dead. Everyone was stunned. The director said that Ja's replacement would be number 8 from Team G. The young man, Masa, pointed at himself, in disbelief. Inside the mine, they swung pickaxes at the rock face. The mine slaves were forced to work from 7 a.m. until 11 p.m., deep inside the tunnels under brutal conditions. The environment was harsh and unforgiving. This truly was slave labor in every sense of the word. It was pure exploitation. One of the overseers said a worker was moving too slowly. He kicked the man in the stomach, saying he was getting in everyone's way. The man groaned in pain on the ground. Masa placed a hand on his shoulder and said the other teams might do things differently, but here, he was the supervisor, and he wouldn't beat anyone, so everyone could work at their own pace. The man was moved and thanked Supervisor Masa. The young man noticed he looked exhausted and told him to take a break. Mikio watched the scene from a distance. The other overseer interrupted, asking if this was some kind of joke. He said the brat was just copying his lazy predecessor, and he hated kind-hearted people more than anything. He asked if Masa wanted to be punished, right then and there, but a pickaxe slammed into his leg. The overseer cried out in pain and demanded to know what that was. George casually remarked that his hand had slipped, and apologized for it. The enraged overseer stormed toward him, demanding to know what his problem was because an apology wasn't going to fix anything. It looked like George was the one who needed punishment. But a voice interrupted, saying he liked what he was seeing. Both of them turned around in surprise. The man said that if it was a fight, he wanted in as well. The miners called out the name Kusanagi and commented that the overseer was finished. The overseer replied that he would never dare challenge him and stood no chance against him. Kusanagi looked annoyed by that response. Then he powerfully launched himself off the ground. He threw a punch, saying that anyone who refused to obey deserved to die. His fist struck the other man's temple head-on. Both were stunned by the blow. Masa shouted that it was unbelievable strength. Mikio realized it wasn't just brute force. Kusanagi had struck a pressure point with incredible precision. Kusanagi turned to Mikio and asked if he wanted to be next, and whether he felt like fighting. Mikio replied that he didn't fight without a reason, and Masa told him he should show Kusanagi some respect. Kusanagi repeated Mikio's name and said, "So you're the one." Then he charged straight at Mikio. Mikio assumed a defensive stance as the man charged toward him. Kusanagi threw a punch, and Mikio blocked it with his guard. Instantly, all the miners were amazed by the flurry of punches. At this rate, Mikio would be killed. The protagonist kept defending, thinking Kusanagi was incredibly fast, powerful, and precise. Everything about him was top tier, but he always left openings. In his attacks, Mikio planted his feet firmly, lipped to the side of Kusanagi's arm, catching him by surprise, and punched him in the face. Everyone was shocked that he had actually landed a hit on Kusanagi. Mikio held his ground. However, Kusanagi had managed to block most of it and said it wasn't bad. "You're pretty interesting. Let's keep fighting until we can't feel anything anymore." But a voice shouted for them to stop. Everyone turned around, not knowing what was happening. They quickly knelt down, saying, "Director." Akechi had arrived. The man continued walking with several miners following behind him. He adjusted his glasses. He was the director of the mine. Mikio realized he was the one in charge here. Akechi called out to Kusanagi. The man immediately stood at attention. Akechi told him not to damage the slaves with these pointless fights. He asked whether Kusanagi wanted him to report this to the Blood Marquis. Kusanagi trembled in fear upon hearing that. He quickly said he had already put that idea aside, and that this had only been a small training session. Akechi asked if he really called that training, when all he had done was throw punches. He shouldn't make him laugh, because no one expected intelligence from a blockhead like him. Kusanagi apologized and clenched his fists. Akechi asked what the slaves were doing. Was their job to crawl around on the floor? They should be digging every second they were breathing, unless they wanted to be thrown away like garbage. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it was lunchtime. The protagonist thought the food was cold and tasteless. The other miners said it wasn't nearly enough, while the supervisors had it so easy. They ate like kings. One of them wished he could try a lunchbox like that just once. Then they collapsed to the ground, complaining about their hunger. Masa offered his lunchbox to the protagonist. He told Mikio to eat. Mikio looked at the food without saying a word. Then he refused, and Masa asked why. The protagonist replied that he had no intention of owing anyone. His friend sat beside him and said this wasn't about being indebted. It was his way of making up for dragging Mikio into trouble last time. When Mikio fought Ja, he had shifted the blame onto him. He had been nothing but a coward, so he couldn't just leave things like that. This was the least he could do. A smile spread across Mikio's face. He took a piece of chicken and said that, for a lie, one piece of fried chicken was a fair price, and now they were even. So Masa should hurry up and eat too. But 2 men approached from behind and said that if Mikio didn't want it, he should give it to them instead. Masa gave each of them a piece. A little later, the director said they had been sitting around eating for long enough, so they should get up immediately and return to their posts. The mine slaves were forced to endure grueling physical labor. They had no human rights. One of the miners suddenly collapsed. Masa rushed over and called out to him, asking if he was all right. He begged the man to stay alive, but the overseer ordered everyone to move on. Masa was shocked by this. The man was kicked aside. The overseer then checked his neck before announcing that the man had died. He was a member of Team G. "Just throw him outside," he ordered. Masa kept calling out to his friend, telling him not to push himself so hard. Even after that, the brutal labor never stopped. The overseer ordered everyone to get back to digging. The loss of a single life would never bring the work here to a halt. A human life was worth less than garbage. They left the man's helmet lying on the ground. Mikio glared angrily at the overseer. Then the bell rang, announcing that the day's work was over and everyone should put down their tools. Masa let out a sigh, saying it was finally over. Then he noticed Mikio still standing there. He asked how Mikio was still on his feet, and the protagonist replied that he was used to this level of hardship. Masa wondered if he had always been this tough. The overseer rang the bell, telling Team G to stop slacking off. After finishing their shift, they were forced to strip naked and walk around, completely exhausted. The overseer ordered them not to stop or even slow down. To prevent ore theft, they had to undergo a full-body inspection before They were allowed to return to the surface. The overseer called for Team 9. He announced that today's wages were ready. Mikio thought to himself that it was only 1,000 yen for 16 hours of work. One of the workers behind him thanked him for the money, saying it had made his day. Mikio wondered how he could possibly be happy with such a tiny amount. Just then, a truck pulled up nearby, and everyone became excited. The protagonist wondered what it was, certain that something was about to happen. The other miners said they had finally arrived. Several women thanked the miners for working so hard today. They explained that because they had worked so hard, everything would be 20% off for them. Mikio repeated those words to himself, a miner's appreciation sale, but the other men rushed toward them, asking for a can of beer and a small bag of potato chips. Another woman also handed out some octopus-flavored snacks. Everyone kept placing orders non-stop. One man cracked open a can of beer and drank it all in one go. He sighed in satisfaction, commenting that it soaked into every cell of his body. Another man remarked that Haida really doesn't get it. He's actually trying to save money on Appreciation Day. He called it the height of inefficiency because he was going all out, spending his entire 1,000 yen to indulge himself. Mikio silently noted how strange it all was. Just moments earlier, they had all been treated like slaves, and now everything had suddenly changed. Masa said everyone must be really happy. Mikio asked if he was planning to buy anything, but the young man replied that he definitely wanted to. Still, he had sworn to save every yen until he could buy a paradise ticket. Mikio asked what that was, and Masa asked if he didn't remember. They had been told about it when they first arrived. The director explained that from that day on, they were slaves, forced to crawl through the dirt. They had to work beyond their physical limits, earning only enough food to survive. Their lives were worse than livestock, but even in hell, money still spoke. If they wanted to grasp the spider's thread, they had to save up 1 million yen. The paradise ticket was what would guarantee their freedom to leave the island. Everyone cheered at the chance to escape, vowing to save enough money to buy one. That man said he would finally see the outside world again, yet he was the very same person spending his money on beer, claiming he had come back to life. Masa said that was when he made his decision. No matter how many times he was beaten or collapsed from exhaustion, he would never spend a single yen. Mikio thought he finally understood. Even in this hellish place, there was no rebellion, because 2 carrots were dangling in front of them. One was the carrot of hope, and the other was the carrot of pleasure, where people drowned themselves and forgot about hope. The mine officials and whoever stood behind them understood this perfectly. The realization filled George with disgust. The young man looked at his money. He wondered how much more he still needed to buy a paradise ticket, and Masa asked why he wanted to know. He said he would never tell him, but Mikio told him to calm down. He promised he wouldn't reveal his secret. He held out the money, saying he just wanted to help him escape. Elsewhere, Mikio calculated that Masa still needed another 60,000 yen, including his own wages. That was 2,000 yen a day. At that rate, Masa would reach his goal in 1 month. Masa thanked him, but wanted to know why he was going this far for him. Mikio told him not to worry, saying they were doing this for his sake. More importantly, he wanted to know if there were any boats, beaches, or docks on the island. Masa said there weren't and told him to go see for himself if he wanted to know what it was really like. The island was surrounded by sheer cliffs. Everyone knew that. The protagonist said he was going to check it out anyway. Masa warned him that escaping was illegal and asked if he had gone crazy, but the protagonist asked whether laws even mattered in a lawless place. Then a sound interrupted his escape. The protagonist turned around and came face to face with a drone. It was tracking him and aiming its weapon at him. He recognized it as a military drone. The drone scanned the area and locked onto its target. Mikio immediately started climbing back up. Masa wondered what was happening. The protagonist reached the top again and shouted for him to run. Masa asked what he was talking about, but a bullet whizzed past him. The young man froze in shock. The two of them started running, fleeing in panic. The drone kept firing at them relentlessly, but its shots only struck the ground as Masa screamed. The chaos continued. The protagonist looked back and realized the drone was an SG Nemesis 1. It targeted anything that moved within its detection radius. Once it locked onto a target, it treated it as a threat and hunted it relentlessly. Its nickname was the Mad Stalker, a weapon of mass slaughter that made even battle-hardened soldiers tremble in fear. The gunfire drew closer and closer, and Masa wondered what was happening. Mikio noticed a bullet lodged in the wall. The protagonist stood his ground. He stepped to the side, and Masa commented that there was no way out. The protagonist simply told him to follow. They continued running through the forest. The drone hovered for a few seconds before resuming the chase. It weaved between several trees, Mikio thought. Just as I expected. Its tracking system is highly specialized. He told Masa to hurry because he was falling behind. The young man said he couldn't run anymore, but the protagonist told him to keep going. Otherwise, he'd lose his life. This is bad. At this rate, we'll be shot. Then he spotted a rat in a tree. He thought, that's it, and moved toward it. He caught the rat in his hand. He announced that he would count to 3, and when he finished, they had to stand completely still. Masa asked if he had gone crazy, shouting that they'd be turned into Swiss cheese, but the protagonist began counting down. The young man tried to protest, while the drone continued firing relentlessly. They leaped behind a large rock, and the drone kept pursuing them. Finally, the countdown reached 1. The protagonist apologized to the rat and threw it toward the drone. It struck the drone's camera. The machine turned to scan the new target, then shifted to the other side. Movement detected. Target changed. New trajectory acquired. It locked onto the rat and opened fire, riddling the poor creature with bullets, even though it had nothing to do with any of this. Afterward, it turned back toward them, but immediately came to a stop. The protagonist didn't flinch. The drone began circling the two of them, analyzing their faces. It emitted a sound when it looked at Masa, but the gun never fired. Then it turned toward Mikio, and did the same to him. A bead of sweat rolled down the protagonist's cheek. He had been worried that the drone would shoot him. The drop of sweat fell onto a leaf. The drone moved in front of them, then slowly ascended. It announced that the execution had been completed. Masa collapsed to the ground from exhaustion, thinking he was done for. The protagonist merely sighed, showing little reaction. Masa wanted to know what that thing was. Mikio explained that it was a drone developed by the Republic of Andermia, designed solely for surveillance and assassination without discrimination. It couldn't distinguish friend from foe. So it was classified as a defective model and removed from military service. Masa asked whether something like that had ever been used in combat, and wondered how Mikio knew so much about it. The protagonist wondered why it was here, of all places. It was so dangerous that selling it or even lending it to other countries was forbidden. That meant the island he was on was probably connected to the Andermia military he had once served. Back at the house, Q called out to the protagonist because his food was burning. The boy said he had come home so late. His mother told him they should welcome him home first. The protagonist asked what they were cooking, and Q replied that it was scrap soup, his favorite dish. Now they could even eat better quality scraps, and he was truly grateful for that. Mikio thought about it for a moment. The boy told everyone to eat because it smelled delicious. Mikio took a bite. He thought the sourness was overwhelming, and this wasn't fit for human consumption. Even military rations tasted better. Q said it was delicious, and the protagonist wondered what was wrong with the boy's taste buds. His mother explained that on an island, even buying scraps was difficult, so he had grown up eating things even worse than this. Q said the earthworm udon was delicious. He told them to look, there was even meat still stuck to the bone. Today was their lucky day. He commented that this was paradise, and told the protagonist to pay for his meals immediately. Mikio asked what he meant, but Q told him to stop playing dumb and hand over the meal money since he'd already been paid. However, the protagonist replied that the money was already gone. He had given it to Masa. The boy was stunned when he heard that. Mikio said that from now on, he intended to keep giving his wages to Masa. The boy was so shocked that he even dropped his food. He said it was all Mikio's fault, and let out an exasperated sigh because there was still a little left. But the protagonist placed the food on the table, saying he had found a better use for it. He told the boy to grab the leftovers and follow him. Q wondered what he meant. In the forest, he watched what Mikio was doing. He asked what he planned to do with a few pieces of scrap metal and a bucket. The protagonist said this was how he did it. Q complained that he had thrown away his food, but the protagonist denied it, saying he hadn't thrown it away. He was simply putting it to another use. Leftover food has a strong smell, and that scent is perfect for attracting wild animals. In other words, this was enough to lure something in. Q asked if he was setting traps and what they were hunting, but the protagonist said it would probably be rats or some other small animal. The boy said he had seriously considered eating rats, but he had heard someone died of stomach illness after doing so. Mikio explained that city rats carry diseases, but wild rats are a valuable source of protein. He asked if the boy didn't like rats, then they could walk a little farther. Q asked about setting more traps. He wanted to know why they had to hide them in these dense bushes. The protagonist replied that the thick brush made them more effective. Animals felt safe approaching them. Q became excited by the idea. A bird was caught. in a trap in a tree, lured by a worm, becoming their next meal. Mikio said this would be enough for tomorrow's lunch, and the boy agreed. At the mining site beside the administration building, an overseer reported that this week's total output was 643 tons of ore. But 9 slaves had died. There had been far too many casualties, most of them likely caused by malnutrition or overwork. He told Director Akechi that even though they were slaves, they were still human, and their food rations and rest time should be increased. Akechi smiled, and said headquarters didn't care about human lives. Yushima tried to argue, but Akechi cut him off, saying that was enough and not to make him repeat himself. As long as production kept increasing, his evaluation would improve, and he would climb the ranks even faster. He had no intention of staying on this garbage-filled island forever, and he didn't care how many slaves died. They would keep using them because mining was the top priority. Yushima simply replied, "Understood, sir." Akechi said it was time for the next report. One of the staff reported that merchandise sales had reached 2.5 million yen, with a 90% recovery rate. This week, those fools had wasted their money on food and drinks again. Akechi replied that by chasing the carrot dangling in front of them, they had fallen into the trap and were hardly smarter than animals. He asked if there were any other reports. The man said there was. He had heard that number 8 from Team G was aiming for a paradise ticket. The others immediately laughed at the idea of a mine slave saving up 1 million yen, saying it had never happened before. Akechi smirked and repeated, "Number 8 of Team G Masa." Later, Masa knocked on the door and asked if Mikio was awake. The protagonist replied that he was already outside. Masa peeked out of the room and was immediately surprised to see the protagonist exercising. He asked what he was doing. Masa replied that he thought they were going to work together and wanted to know what he was doing. The protagonist walked down and asked, "Isn't it obvious? This body is too weak. If he wanted to achieve his goal, he needed to become much stronger." Masa replied that he was really strange. Q woke up and asked what all the noise was so early in the morning. The boy noticed Masa and asked who he was. The young man replied that he was Mikio's co-worker. Q said, "So you're the one stealing his wages. You need to give them back, because that's my meal money. We barely have enough to eat here." Masa was reminded of the past. His little sister said she was hungry. He asked if it tasted good, and she replied that it was delicious. She loved the toast her big brother made. Masa thought about making it for them again someday, and quietly apologized to himself. The young man promised to bring something delicious next time, so he asked the boy to let it slide just this once. Q agreed, but said whatever he brought next time had better be worth at least 1,000 yen. Mikio got dressed and headed into the underground mining tunnel. Masa shouted that the tunnel was unstable and called for support. He said the two of them were enough to move it safely. Ishizuka said he would carry it from this side. Akechi interrupted, saying that was excellent leadership. He truly valued safety. Just as the rumors said, "Number 8, you're impressive." Masa asked how he knew about him, but Akechi replied that he was quite well known. He had kept Team 5 under control, without using violence, resulting in higher productivity. So the rumors were true. Masa smiled and thanked him, saying it was an honor. Akechi told him there was no need to be so formal, because he had come for a reason. He wanted to give him a special reward for showing so much potential. A reward like this would boost morale, and Yushima could only sigh in frustration. Mikio noticed the exchange from a distance. Akechi said it was too dangerous to hand it over in public. You never know who's watching in a place like this, so he told Masa to follow him somewhere more private. Masa asked if Mikio had heard that, saying they might be able to save up for the paradise ticket even faster. The protagonist said he had a bad feeling about this, and warned him to be careful. Masa replied that he was overthinking it, and should be grateful for the opportunity. With that, he walked away, saying he had been waiting for this moment. Kusanagi said, "So you're Mikio. If you're worried about your friend, he's enjoying a little party at home right now." Even so, Mikio's expression remained grim. Masa announced that they had arrived at his house. He said this was where he lived, though it was far too filthy, but the man said that was perfectly fine. A private room would suit their needs better. Masa said he was delighted and invited them inside. He apologized, saying he would make them some tea. He smiled and told them to make themselves at home, but Akechi immediately complained, saying it was even filthier than he had expected, and the stench was making his nose rot. Masa was stunned by the remark. Akechi ordered his subordinates to search the place immediately. They began tearing the entire room apart. Kusanagi punched Masa in the stomach. He collapsed to the floor, coughing violently. One of the men pinned him down and restrained his arms. Masa asked who they really were. Akechi said he was trying to buy a paradise ticket and wanted to know where the money was. He didn't like wasting time. If Masa told him now, he would only lose the money. Masa said no, asking if the special reward had been a lie. Akechi said he had just confirmed that all slaves were fools. Masa realized he had been tricked and insisted he had no money because he was just a slave. Akechi remarked that Masa still intended to waste his time, then ordered his subordinate to retrieve it, pulling a pair of pliers from his pocket. Masa wondered what he intended to do, with the pliers clamped around his teeth. The young man began screaming and begged him to stop, but the tool tightened and ripped one of his teeth out. Akechi calmly told the man to continue. Masa's tooth, it was torn out, and he writhed in agony. Akechi asked if he hadn't already warned him. If he had talked, he would have only lost his money. Now he had to choose. Tell them where the money was, or lose something else. Back at the mine, everyone remarked that team leader Masa still hadn't returned. Looks like that damned supervisor took a liking to him. He's probably off partying or something. Mikio noticed Goshima approaching and thought he was with Akechi earlier. Mikio walked over and asked where team leader number 8 was. Goshima said he didn't know, but the protagonist demanded to know what they were plotting. The man turned away without answering, telling him not to get involved any further. After all, he still had a place to return to. Back at the house, Masa's screams echoed through the room. They kept pulling out his teeth one after another. Then they paused briefly to let him catch his breath. Akechi said that if this kept up, he'd never be able to eat again, so talking now would be the smartest choice. Masa continued insisting that he didn't know. Akechi demanded, "You're really not going to tell me where the money is? You can't even make a simple decision like that? Fine. I'll show you a little mercy." He picked up the pliers and grabbed another tooth, bringing it close to Masa's mouth. Masa wondered what he was planning to do with it. Then they shoved the pliers and the tooth back into his mouth. Akechi said his tooth had now been returned to its rightful place, and that it was better for him this way. But now, they would repeat the extraction and reimplantation all over again. He clapped his hands, ordering his subordinate to pull it out again, then force it back in. He repeated the same order several more times. The subordinate wore a sickening grin. Masa could do nothing but writhe in agony, while the director watched with delight. Hours passed, and every tooth in his mouth was gone. So Akechi asked if he still wasn't willing to reveal where the money was. The young man breathed heavily as he remembered his little sister. He decided he would never give up that money, because he had to leave this island. His sister was in the hospital. He apologized, as she said the surgery would cost a fortune, but Masa had told her not to worry because he had found a good job. He promised to earn plenty of money, and even bring her a souvenir. Masa thought that if he never returned, his little sister would be all alone. He couldn't let them take that money away from him. Akechi grew irritated by the look in his eyes. He said, "You're nothing but a slave. You can't keep acting so tough, or you'll lose every last tooth." Masa replied that he didn't have the money. Akechi flew into a rage, calling him a brainless piece of trash. But Kusanagi intervened, kicking his own subordinate aside. Akechi asked what he was doing. Kusanagi replied, "At this rate, he'll never talk." The director asked what he planned to do. The blond man grabbed Masa by the shirt and said he was simply finishing what had been started. He admitted he was impressed. Then he swung with all his strength, driving a merciless punch into Masa's stomach. The young man writhed in agony as his ribs shattered. Kusanagi said that refusing to break even after all this made him a real man. That was exactly what made beating him so entertaining. His overwhelming brute strength could break bones with a single punch, and his violent nature genuinely enjoyed hurting people. The pain and terror were so unbearable that Masa found himself wishing they would go back to pulling out his teeth instead. Kusanagi sneered that he might as well die. Masa closed his eyes, thinking of his little sister, Yui. She had said she didn't need any souvenirs, and would be happy as long as her brother came home. Then another punch slammed into him. Akechi remarked that it looked horrible and must have hurt, and that if he talked, Kusanagi would stop. But Masa was punched in the face again, remembering Yui, telling him, "I love you, big brother." The young man was sent flying backward. Akechi told him to simply reveal where the money was, but Masa struggled back to his feet and said he didn't have it. Akechi replied that confirmed it, and Kusanagi was free to kill him. At that moment, Mikio sprinted toward the house, furious. He burst through the door, only to freeze at the sight before him. Masa lay on the floor, his body covered in injuries. Mikio could only call out his name. The protagonist stood there in shock as Masa continued groaning. Mikio noticed fractures from the 6th rib, all the way down to the lower ribs. His breathing was abnormally rapid, which meant a broken rib had most likely punctured his lung. He had a broken nose and fractured eye socket, along with multiple skull fractures. There were puncture wounds and deep lacerations inside his mouth. He had lost many teeth. His pulse was weak due to damage to the aorta and traumatic shock. No matter how severe it was, Mikio wondered what kind of monster could have done this. Masa said Mikio had been right about his warning, and the bastards were after his money, but he had decided to protect it to the very end. Mikio quietly replied that he understood. Masa said he would never be able to use that money now, so he wanted to give it to him. Mikio said he wasn't the type to accept favors so easily, and Masa should recover first and spend it himself. But Masa grabbed his hand and told him to take the money. He knew he was going to die, and if he didn't hand it over now, the money would be lost forever. He asked Mikio to come closer. If he left the house and walked straight ahead, he would find a large tree with a slash mark near the shore. The money was buried beneath it. He had worked so hard to save every yen, yet now he was giving it all away. In return, he had one request. When Mikio escaped from the island, he had to find his little sister. Mikio asked about her, and Masa remembered the day she wished him a happy birthday. He said she had cut a piece of fabric from her own dress, even though it was her favorite one. Yui replied that she simply wanted to give it to him because he always worked so hard. Back in the present, Masa said she was a wonderful girl, so he begged Mikio to finha. Mikio said he couldn't make that promise, but Masa gripped his hand and pleaded, saying her name was Yui Hanjo, and if Mikio found her, he had to tell her that her foolish big brother never forgot about her, not even until his very last moment. Then, he thanked Mikio for everything. A moment later, he drew his final breath. The protagonist looked at the young man, placed a hand on his forehead, and gently closed his eyes. A single tear fell from Masa's eye as he remembered his sister. The protagonist carried his body out of the house. Without another thought, he walked straight ahead, to the tree Masa had pointed out. The protagonist began digging, pulling a small box out of the ground. He took out several bundles of cash, called out Masa's name, and said, "I've accepted your money." Then he removed the band from his wrist, unwrapped the rest of it, and said, "I'll be taking this too, to cover my face." Akechi thanked him for leading them here, saying that in the end, Masa had lost his life. He was a rare kind of fool, suffering for something so meaningless, only to lose both his money and his life, a fitting end for worthless trash. Then, he declared that no matter what, this filthy slave had to hand over that dirty money. Mikio simply stood up and said he refused. Akechi replied that, just as he thought, all slaves were idiots, and Mikio was no different from that useless piece of trash. He then ordered his men to take the money from him. The protagonist charged forward, dodged one man's attack, and countered with a punch straight to his face. He did the same, driving his elbow into another subordinate. A third man rushed at him but was met with a vicious uppercut, sending him crashing to the ground, unable to move. Mikio declared that Masa had entrusted this money to him. It was now his war fund, and if they intended to take it, he would have to eliminate every one of them. One subordinate got back up with a bloodied nose, while Akechi pulled something from inside his coat, saying they were all useless. He raised a finger, then drew his pistol. The protagonist immediately became alert, but Kusanagi grabbed Akechi's arm, saying that if it were him, he would stop. It wasn't worth wasting a bullet, and he would finish what he had started. Mikio said nothing, but remained ready to fight. Akechi told him not to drag it out, and Kusanagi agreed. The two fighters took their stances. Kusanagi rushed toward the protagonist, unleashing a flurry of blows, but Mikio dodged everyone. Mikio realized that Kusanagi was also a professionally trained boxer. Kusanagi threw a straight punch, saying, "Your footwork is impressive, but dodging alone won't win you this fight." The protagonist slipped past the punch and prepared to counter, driving a punch straight into Kusanagi's liver. The protagonist let out an angry sigh. Akechi smiled. Kusanagi praised the liver shot, saying it was just strong enough to feel like a massage. Kusanagi immediately launched a counterattack. The protagonist tried to block with his arms, but the impact sent him flying backward. Mikio was stunned by the force of the blow. Akechi thought that no matter how skilled a cat was, it could never defeat a tiger. The protagonist charged again, throwing a barrage of punches at Kusanagi's face. Akechi thought he was certainly quick, but attacks at that level would never stop Kusanagi. Mikio raised his guard, letting the punch crash into his arms, yet he was blasted backward once again. Mikio managed to keep his footing and realized he was standing at the edge of a cliff where jagged rocks plunged into the sea below. Kusanagi stepped forward and asked if he really thought he could turn the fight around, just by staying on the defensive, calling him hopelessly naive. The next instant, his fist shot forward, but the protagonist slipped to the side, setting up a counter of his own. He landed a perfect punch on Kusanagi's jaw, then followed with another from the opposite side. Mikio remained stone-faced, but Kusanagi laughed, saying Mikio was even better than he had expected, and was making the fight far more interesting. Now this was the kind of battle he wanted. The protagonist lowered his stance, and Kusanagi noticed it was another countering posture. However, something was different this time, so he stopped, shifting his feet before throwing the punch instead of committing immediately. Akechi realized that this slave was reading Kusanagi like a seasoned boxer, and he was absolutely right. But Kusanagi also had devastating kicks. The protagonist shifted his arms and used his entire stance to block the kick. Kusanagi was genuinely surprised by that move. Then, the protagonist pulled him in and executed a takedown, slamming the larger man to the ground. Even Akechi was completely stunned. The protagonist locked him in a grappling hold. Kusanagi asked how Mikio had read him so perfectly. The protagonist explained that his center of gravity was low and his lower body remained stable without rising or falling, a hallmark of a kickboxer. He then drove an elbow into Kusanagi's face. Kusanagi groaned in pain. Then, the protagonist charged again. The big man flashed a wide grin, grabbed Mikio by the throat, and squeezed with all his strength, saying, "Too bad, you got too close." He immediately reversed the hold, saying that if this had been a martial arts match, but it wasn't. What they were having now was a no-rules street fight. He continued choking the protagonist. Akechi wondered when the last time he had seen Kusanagi get this serious was. Slave uprisings had happened many times in the past, and countless fighters had been confident in their skills, but not a single one had ever defeated Kusanagi. He was a true street brawler, and there was no way he'd lose to a mere martial artist. Kusanagi said martial arts were elegant, but they could never defeat him. The protagonist moved again, striking Kusanagi's chin with the heel of his palm. He then grabbed Kusanagi's arm. The big man realized Mikio had used the palm strike to create the space he needed to pivot. Mikio trapped his arm and slammed him to the ground. Akechi was startled by what he saw. The protagonist then began twisting Kusanagi's arm, repeating his own words, "This is a street fight." Kusanagi was even more shocked to hear that. The protagonist kept twisting his arm. The large man began screaming in agony as his arm was bent farther and farther until the protagonist snapped it completely. Kusanagi let out an even more agonizing scream. The protagonist climbed on top of him and said, "Don't get the wrong idea. This was supposed to be a street fight. In fact, it couldn't even be called a fight. It was nothing more than a one-sided slaughter in his favor." The strongest man in the elite unit, Ghost of Andermia, George Sisai. Despite his unmatched combat skills, he had never been in an ordinary street fight. Kusanagi moved again, saying, "This is getting interesting." The protagonist simply looked at two of his fingers, then smashed them apart with a headbutt. Kusanagi cried out in even greater pain. George had only ever fought battles where lives were on the line. He drove his elbow down like a hammer onto his opponent's face. That was the only kind of combat George Tsai had ever known. The protagonist's next punch narrowly missed. Kusanagi gasped in absolute terror, thinking, an ordinary person, and would hesitate when it came time to take a life. But this man was completely different. He was calm, efficient, and utterly confident. The protagonist threw another punch. Kusanagi tried to defend himself, realizing Mikio was genuinely trying to kill him. The strike tore through his guard and slammed directly into his throat. Kusanagi immediately began coughing, realizing the man before him wasn't a martial artist, and certainly wasn't just a street brawler. This couldn't be possible. He was a professional killer. Kusanagi writhed on the ground in pain, thinking Mikio was using the same martial art as George Sisai, a veteran soldier. Krav Maga, the combat system used by special forces in several countries, one of the world's deadliest fighting styles. The protagonist picked up a rock from the ground. He raised it high and moved toward Kusanagi's face, bringing it down with all his strength without hesitation. But a voice stopped him from taking the man's life. Q had once told him never to do that, so he wouldn't become a killer. He gave up and threw the rock away. It plunged into the sea below. The protagonist then stood up, but suddenly heard laughter. Kusanagi got to his feet and said, "Now this is better. This is exactly what I've been looking for. We'll fight until one of us dies." The protagonist raised his guard once more, but he was surprised by what happened next. He dodged as a gunshot struck Kusanagi. The protagonist moved closer to the edge of the cliff. Kusanagi wondered what was happening as blood poured from his chest. The protagonist grabbed onto the cliff's edge, letting out a weary sigh. Then Akechi complained that he had missed his shot, but at least he could punish the loser. Kusanagi was even more enraged by those words. Akechi told him not to get angry. A useless dog that couldn't even defeat Emiyasleo deserved to be put down. The brute completely lost his temper and charged straight at his own boss. Akechi kept firing, shouting for the damn dog to stop moving. He shot Kusanagi again, but he refused to stop. Akechi fired another round, hitting his side and arm, yet he couldn't believe it, and wondered why Kusanagi still wouldn't stop. Kusanagi lunged forward with a punch, yelling, "Go to hell!" Annoyed, Akechi fired one last shot into the brute's forehead. Kusanagi's fist finally stopped inches from him, and he collapsed at Akechi's feet. The director burst into laughter. He then kicked Kusanagi in the face, calling him a stubborn mad dog that had finally died. He continued trampling on Kusanagi's corpse. Then he asked his remaining subordinates how long they intended to stand there and ordered them to move. Kusanagi had died at the hands of the slave who stole his weapon, and that was the story they would report to the Blood Knights. But before that, there was something else to deal with. The one responsible for Kusanagi's death had to be punished. Mikio simply stared back. Akechi aimed his gun and said he admired in his incredible fighting skills, but no matter how strong he was, one man could never win a battle. In the modern world, what truly mattered were brains and guns. Mikio slowly raised his hands. Akechi was surprised by the gesture, then a twisted smile spread across his face. He said, "Of course. Anyone would be terrified when a gun is pointed at them. Are you planning to surrender?" The protagonist said nothing. Akechi continued, "I'm going to kill you, because you'll pay dearly for all the time and ammunition you've wasted." He strode toward Mikio and said that backing himself against the cliff had been a fatal mistake. But the protagonist said everything was going according to plan. Akechi asked, "What's that sound?" A military drone rose into the sky above them. Akechi asked what it was, and the protagonist looked up. The director kept asking about the mad stalker. His men wondered if it was just a small drone. One of them stepped forward, only to be shot in the head, and collapsed to the ground instantly. Akechi was stunned by what he saw. Seeing the dead body on the ground, his remaining men panicked. The mad stalker prepared to fire again as the other two fled. Movement detected. Target locked. Pursuing for elimination. Mikio kept repeating that it was the mad stalker. It relentlessly hunted anything that moved. The men screamed for help as the drone shifted slightly, then killed another target without missing a shot. Akechi still kept his gun trained on Mikio's head. The protagonist realized that this man hadn't moved at all since the drone appeared, and wondered if that meant he already knew about the mad stalker. The two stared at each other without saying a word, while the drone slowly drifted toward them. Akechi sighed, growing even angrier. He realized the boy had deliberately lured them to the mad stalker, and wondered how a mere slave could possibly know about it. But none of that mattered anymore. This brat had gone too far, and he deserved to die. Mikio said that if Akechi understood how the drone operated, then he also knew that the moment he pulled the trigger, he would become one of its targets. Akechi was completely taken aback by those words. The drone turned toward the two of them. Akechi thought Mikio was just bluffing, because such a tiny movement wouldn't activate it. The protagonist said, "Go ahead and try. Then you'll find out whether I'm bluffing or not." The director hesitated. The protagonist asked if he wasn't going to hurl insults like usual, or had he finally become too terrified to even open his mouth? Akechi said he would kill Mikio for insulting him, a crime worthy of execution. Moving a finger just a few centimeters should be safe. But the drone buzzed closer to him. Akechi still wondered how it would react. The drone drifted a little closer. Mikio thought his theory was correct, but he still wasn't sure whether it would actually trigger. All he could do now was wait. Soon enough, the mad stalker would decide its mission was complete and leave. When that happened, he would dodge the bullets and take Akechi down without mercy. The drone stopped between the two of them. The director trembled as he cursed at Mikio, wondering what he should do now. The night passed with a breeze blowing toward them, causing their hair to sway. The drone suddenly shifted to one side. Akechi smirked, thinking this was his chance. He fired relentlessly at the protagonist. One bullet struck Mikio's arm, forcing him to move. The drone detected the movement. The protagonist was now locked on as the target. He took off at full speed and began running. The drone moved in for the kill, firing at the protagonist as he ran. Mikio headed straight for the cliff. He was hit by another bullet. Then he leaped high into the air, this time toward the cliff's edge. The drone beeped several times before shooting him in the thigh. The pain hit the protagonist instantly. Akechi smirked and fired another shot at the same spot. The protagonist began falling uncontrollably. He cried out, then realized his situation. He quickly tucked his body midair, adjusting his landing. He plunged into the water below. The drone continued pursuing him, flying forward and firing relentlessly, even into the water. The protagonist was hit several more times, groaning in pain as the drone began circling overhead. The protagonist dived even deeper. The hunter beeped once more, signaling that the execution had been completed. Akechi was surprised by this. He walked to the edge of the cliff and said he assumed Mikio was dead. Then he laughed at the thought of a mere slave daring to challenge him. His laughter grew even more maniacal. Meanwhile, beneath the cliff, the protagonist slowly resurfaced. He wondered if they had finally left. Then a sharp pain shot through his body. He noticed his leg was bleeding heavily. He removed the cloth from his mouth and tied it around his leg. He reflected that he had let his guard down, and the bullet was still lodged inside him. He needed to remove it, and somehow treat the wound. Blood began spreading through the water. The protagonist noticed something moving toward him beneath the surface. Mikio wondered if something was approaching. It had to be a predator. A shark lunged at him. Mikio was completely caught off guard, but he managed to dodge its jaws. He wondered if it had smelled his blood. The creature before Mikio was the apex predator of the ocean, a great white shark. Its torpedo-shaped body cut through the water, at speeds of up to 50 kilometers per hour. Its bite force easily exceeded 1 ton. The protagonist dodged another bite, already running out of air, but the shark's tail was closing in. It slammed into him as he tried to evade it. Mikio thought, "This is bad." He had already lost too much oxygen, yet the shark kept circling him. Mikio surfaced for air as the shark turned back. He prepared to dive beneath the water once again. He spread his arms and remained perfectly still before the shark. They were ambush predators. They hated being detected by their prey. He released a killing intent, hoping to drive the shark away. But his wound was still bleeding. The shark sensed it and charged toward him with its jaws wide open. The protagonist realized it had caught the scent of his blood. He would have to strike one of its vital weak points. That's when Mikio aimed for the shark's snout, where the ampullae of Lorenzini were located, its unique sensory organs. That was one of a shark's greatest weak points. The protagonist wondered if it would work, but the shark kept charging forward, slamming into his abdomen. Then the creature lunged again with its jaws wide open. Mikio realized it wasn't working. The difference in physical strength between them was simply overwhelming. He was knocked back into the water again, enduring the pain surging through his body. He surfaced to catch his breath. Mikio looked around, trying to find the shark, but it was already approaching from behind. Mikio spun around in shock as the shark opened its jaws, tearing away a piece of his clothing. The protagonist struggled to catch his breath, but against the ocean's greatest predator, human strength was meaningless. He realized he was running out of air. His consciousness was beginning to fade. There was no other way. If this was truly the end, he would accept it. He refused to cling to life in disgrace. At last, he lost consciousness. Then a voice called out, "George Tsai, wake up." It was a woman. She made him promise that no matter what happened, he had to survive and come back alive. The protagonist opened his eyes and thought of Sophia. He grabbed both sides of the shark and climbed onto its back. The protagonist thought he was about to break another promise. This time, it would be truly pathetic. He returned to the mindset of George, threw a punch, and struck the shark. The protagonist kept attacking, determined to never stop punching. The massive creature, the shark, became enraged. The size difference was absurd, and the water's resistance greatly weakened his blows. Even targeting the weak spot on its snout had no effect. There was no way to injure the king of the ocean. Like this. So the protagonist pulled the torn piece of cloth from the shark's teeth. He swam away, circling behind it. He grabbed onto the shark's gills and used them to move with it. The protagonist focused all his strength on the shark's gills, striking with everything he had. Inside the shark's body, however, was a different story. He wondered if the shark liked the feeling of its organs being torn apart. The protagonist thrust his hand deeper inside. The shark immediately panicked, thrashing violently from side to side. Mikio thought there was no way he'd let it throw him off. Summoning every ounce of strength, he ripped one of its internal organs out. The shark began sinking. Mikio realized he had run out of air. The protagonist burst to the surface and took a deep breath. As he slowly recovered, the shark surfaced behind him. Mikio turned around, wondering if it would charge again. The shark lunged at him, and the protagonist froze. With its jaws wide open, it used the last of its strength to rush straight toward him. The protagonist didn't react, but the shark suddenly collapsed, right in front of him, and sank beneath the sea. It disappeared into the ocean depths. The protagonist gasped for breath as the adrenaline faded. He looked up and thought Sophia had saved him. but it seemed he had drifted far out into the open ocean. He needed to get back to the island as quickly as possible, treat these wounds, and find shelter. Then the protagonist lost consciousness, helplessly floating at sea. Sometime later, he sat up, coughing violently. He thought he had completely exhausted himself. He was freezing and had lost a tremendous amount of blood. He wondered whether he could really make it back in this condition. Then a ray of light shone across his back. The protagonist turned around, seeing the sun rising over the horizon. He muttered, "Morning already." He noticed a tree branch floating nearby, and took it as a good sign. He swam over and grabbed onto it. He climbed onto the branch to rest. Lying there, he tried to recover, breathing heavily. The protagonist gritted his teeth and stared into the sky as the sun climbed higher. He rolled onto his back, thinking, "I've survived again." Waves gently lapped against the shore. The protagonist had finally reached a small island. He figured it had been about 5 hours since he was shot. He needed to remove the bullets and treat his wounds immediately. But he blacked out again, collapsing face first onto the ground. He thought, "This is bad. My body temperature is dropping." Something was approaching from above. The protagonist wondered if it was an enemy, because his body could no longer move. A voice asked him if he could hear them and if he knew his own name. The protagonist's thoughts drifted back to when he was George Sisai. He was at the shooting range, repeating the same motions, and hitting the bullseye every single time, until a voice called out, "George." A young, blonde man asked if he was really George. He introduced himself as Rory, the newest recruit of Ghost, and said it was an honor to meet him. George walked right past him and apologized, saying he wasn't very good at socializing. The young man quietly lowered his head. He said his parents had been killed by terrorists, and the man who avenged them was the legendary warrior standing before him. He wanted to become as strong as George, shouting that George was his hero. The protagonist looked back in surprise, but simply replied that he had only been doing his duty. Rory was left speechless by the answer. A few days later, their unit came under artillery fire from a terrorist force, suffering heavy casualties. The wounded needed immediate treatment. Several medics carried Rory away, reporting that he was conscious with a blood pressure of 80/40. They immediately began treating the injured soldiers. A doctor said George had a shoulder wound, but George told him to ignore it because it was only a minor injury. Then a familiar voice called his name. Rory, lying on a stretcher, asked if he was okay. George told him not to speak. Sophia shouted that Rory had suffered a massive abdominal wound from shrapnel, along with a confirmed pelvic fracture. Rory thought he would never be able to become like George after all. The protagonist was left speechless. The young man admitted that he didn't want to die, that he was terrified of death. George replied that everyone dies eventually. There was nothing to be afraid of. Whether you live or die, it doesn't really matter. Sophia said that if George could still move, he should help carry the stretcher to the operating room and use this gauze to apply firm pressure. She urged him to hurry because they were desperately short-handed. Sophia introduced herself as a military doctor and declared that they were going to save everyone. A few moments later, inside the operating room, someone reported that his vital signs were dropping. Sophia shouted that a good doctor never panicked in front of an injured patient. As long as he was her patient, she refused to let him die. George was deeply impressed by her words. He looked down with a determined expression. As evening fell, the other nurses remarked how incredible she was. Sophia had truly saved them all. So the rumors were true. She had become a doctor at just 27 and volunteered in war zones. George thought, so that's the doctor's name. But Sophia tapped him on the shoulder with a bottle, saying it was a little bribe. She had asked someone with no medical training to help, and that could get her into serious trouble. If he told anyone, she'd be finished. She then took a sip from the bottle and celebrated, saying, "This calls for a drink." George was surprised by her attitude. He asked if Rory was going to make it. Sophia replied that it was hard to say whether his chances were high, but she had witnessed miraculous recoveries many times before. George asked if she ever thought it was all meaningless. Even after doing everything she could to save them, the soldiers would simply return to the battlefield. He wanted to know if all of it was ultimately pointless. Sophia answered that even so, she still wanted to save lives. She took another sip just then. A doctor rushed over and shouted that Rory had regained consciousness. Sophia was overjoyed to hear the news, and the two of them hurried over. She asked Rory how he felt and whether he was in pain. The young man said yes, and Sophia smiled, telling him not to die so easily. George was taken aback by that. He remembered Rory saying he didn't want to die. Then he remembered Sophia saying she still wanted to save lives. The young woman smiled, and the protagonist fell into thought for a moment. Sophia examined his shoulder and removed the bandage. She said he had taken excellent care of it, because the swelling had gone down, and there were no signs of infection. It had healed completely. Then she asked if he could buy her a drink, to thank her for treating him. George asked, "What kind of punishment is that?" And Sophia wanted to know why having a drink with her would be considered a punishment. Everyone started shouting that the two of them had gotten close lately, and had probably already kissed, while others offered to buy Sophia a drink themselves. They added that the legendary war hero was much friendlier than he looked. The young woman let out a sigh. Just then, Rory called out to George, saying he had made up his mind. He was leaving the Phantoms. George replied that it was a serious decision, and with Rory's skill set, he would never be able to walk away so easily. Rory answered that George was probably right. Sophia had just saved his life, so he owed her everything. To be honest, he had never expected this. He thought a unit like Ghost would be far more ruthless. The protagonist realized he felt the same way. He had never experienced an atmosphere like this before, and Sophia was the one who had created it. Even on the battlefield, laughter could still be heard. The soldiers had moments of peace of their own. But for George Tisai, this might be his final moment of rest. A few days later, after everything that had happened, Sophia asked what was going on. Beck replied that the patient had gone into cardiac arrest, and they had to save him at all costs. Sophia said she understood, and that they needed to get him to the operating room immediately. George noticed all of this from a distance. As he watched the body being carried past, he noticed a wound on the man's forehead, but kept his thoughts to himself. Outside the medical center, the protagonist thought that the burn mark had been caused by a powerful electric current forced through the victim's body. He then asked whether the enemy, the man they captured earlier, was a spy from a hostile nation. Beck said George was still as sharp as ever. The protagonist said he always extracted information from his targets at the very last second, but forcing someone into cardiac arrest was never his style. Beck replied that it was Ryan, the electrical specialist, who had ruined everything. Ryan had been in charge, so the responsibility was his. George asked if Beck still wanted to save the man, and Beck said there was still a mountain of information he needed to extract from him. The protagonist wanted to know who the man was. Beck hesitated for a moment, then revealed that he was a financier and an arms dealer, an underworld kingpin named Ses Aras, a senior executive of Ignition. The protagonist froze, clenching his fists. He thought about Ignition. For 16 years, George had never forgotten that name, not even for a single moment. Back when George was still Joji, the little boy had begged to eat that fruit, and his father agreed, saying they would give it a try. It became a family trip to the Republic of Andermia, the only time his workaholic father had ever taken the family anywhere. It lasted only 5 short days, but to Joji, it became a memory, more precious than anything else, or at least, it should have been. People ran in every direction after a terrorist bombing that day. The indiscriminate attack killed and injured more than 200 people. His father told him to run as far away as he could. George looked at his father lying motionless on the ground. He tried to pull his little sister away, but fell backward instead, his hand still tightly gripping her arm. The news in Japan reported that 2 Japanese citizens had been killed and 1 remained missing, but the young boy would never understand. The president of the Republic of Andermia issued a statement regarding today's attack. "We declare this an act of war. They have taken countless innocent lives, and they are the worst kind of terrorists. But we will never forget the name of the organization known as Ignition." Back in the present, at the training center, Beck said that in the 16 years since the attack, they had never found a single clue leading to Ignition, but they had finally discovered one of its hideouts. George was furious to hear that. Beck said the official orders would be issued soon, but he wanted George to know in advance that his next mission would be the operation to wipe out Ignition. The protagonist thought that back then he had been powerless, but he was no longer that helpless child. He had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Beck's radio suddenly crackled. Headquarters ordered him to respond, saying there was a serious problem. The commander asked what had happened. A soldier reported that Ses had disappeared, and so had Sophia. Beck asked, "Sophia's missing too?" George was stunned to hear that. Meanwhile, in the forest, the young woman was breathing heavily outside the military camp's perimeter. Sophia stumbled and struck her head. Ses said there was no time to stop, and that she had to get up and keep walking. Sophia told him not to be ridiculous, and to at least let her treat his wound, but he pressed a knife against her face. Ses said they were already beyond the camp's security perimeter, which meant she was no longer valuable as a hostage. The two continued onward. Ses kept the knife pointed at her. The young woman swallowed nervously, but then a clicking sound came from Sess's molar. He said, "Landing coordinates are D9. It's a little tight, but I can make it." Sophia realized it was a transmitter, hidden inside one of his teeth. She wondered how many devices had been implanted into his body. A few hours earlier, she had decided to attach a patch that monitored his vital signs. His heart had been stopped for quite some time, and in a case like that, resuscitation should have been impossible. She couldn't understand how he had come back to life. It made no sense, because they hadn't even begun treatment yet. Perhaps he had never suffered cardiac arrest in the first place. Sophia turned around and said the man was still alive, but blood suddenly splattered across her face. Sophia stared at the horrifying scene in shock. Sess had just killed the nurse. The woman coughed while his expression remained completely emotionless. Sophia was now overwhelmed with terror. But Sess told her not to scream. He explained that he had a device implanted in his chest that suppressed his heartbeat. It slowed his pulse to the point where it couldn't be detected unless specialized equipment was used. It was an incredibly useful device in situations like this, but it had one drawback. It caused severe nausea after use. Sophia became even more frightened. Sess said, "Please don't scream, because when that person wakes up in a bad mood and hears screaming, it makes them want to kill someone." He added that he had planned to use her as insurance to escape the base and take her hostage. He asked if she would come with him. Then he said he wouldn't force her, even as he pressed the knife against her face, because even without that insurance, it wouldn't really be a problem for him. Sophia began crying. Back in the present, she thought about the terrorist organization Ignition. Their technology was far more advanced than she had imagined. But that wasn't the worst part. The truly horrifying thing was their cold-blooded brutality, willingly implanting devices into human bodies to achieve their goals, and their sheer cruelty. They took lives as if it meant nothing. For them, it was simply kill or be killed. The young woman realized she had one chance, and it was the only chance she had. As someone who worked on the battlefield, she always carried various medications with her. One of them was the vial in her pocket. It was a powerful, sedative painkiller that eased pain and suffering. But even a slightly excessive dose could induce a coma. The medication she carried was highly concentrated, and just 2 milligrams could render someone unconscious. If she injected a full 10 milligrams, it would certainly kill him. The two continued moving forward. A bird remained perched on a branch, then suddenly lifted its head. A sound began drawing closer. Sophia realized this was her moment. Moving as fast as she could, she drove the needle into the man's neck. Sess was caught off guard. Sophia pushed the plunger all the way down, injecting the entire syringe. Sess then lost consciousness. The young woman stared at him in disbelief, until the man collapsed to the ground. She let out a shaky breath as the adrenaline began to fade. Staring at his trembling body, she thought perhaps 10 milligrams had been too much, but then, Sess moved his hand again, grabbing the young woman by the throat. He mentioned the drug she had injected, saying it wasn't a bad plan, but he had developed a resistance to it over the years. She should have known that if someone was repeatedly overdosed from childhood, this was the inevitable result. Sophia thought it was insane. Sess said it had been a long time since he'd taken that drug, and it actually felt pretty good. So now, he decided he would dismember her. By the way, there weren't any painkillers left anymore. She had used them all on him, so it was entirely her fault. He then touched his chest and said that life was only borrowed. Sophia was bewildered by his attitude. Sess continued, saying that the soul was merely entrusted to them. Then he called upon his god, asking to be taken away. He swung his blade at Sophia. The young woman closed her eyes in terror, but when she looked down, she realized he had only slashed her clothes. She gasped, even more frightened. Then, Sess gently touched her face, telling her not to be afraid, because fear seeped into the flesh. For example, if livestock felt fear before being slaughtered, the meat became tough. That was because stress hormones took over, making the meat darker, firmer, and less flavorful. It was such a terrible waste. After raising an animal with care for 2 or 3 years, only to ruin such precious meat in the end, he suddenly began crying while still gripping Sophia by the throat. Sess let out a long sigh, catching his breath. He wiped away his tears, and softly told her not to be afraid, because he would cut her apart, as quietly and gently as possible. Then he asked her to smile. Sophia could only think that he was a monster. The knife slowly moved closer to her. The young woman couldn't stop. Thinking that he was a monster, wearing human skin, the blade crept closer. Sophia simply shut her eyes in terror. Then blood splattered onto the ground, and Sess dropped the knife. It fell into the grass. Sophia was stunned by what had happened. There was now a hole through Sess's hand. He looked at it in shock, then raised his hand to shield his eyes. He saw that the shot had also struck a nearby rock. Sez immediately realized there was a sniper. Sophia thought it might be a rescue team. From a distance, George waited, holding his sniper rifle and preparing to fire again. He took aim once more, then fired another shot. The bullet raced towards Sez. The man ducked, and the round grazed his ear. He slammed Sophia onto the ground, and muttered. The shot came from the 2 o'clock direction. Sound delay, 2 seconds. That puts the shooter roughly 700 meters away. Another shot followed. Sez said the coordinates had been confirmed. He then wondered how many enemies there were, because the radio traffic was strangely silent. He should have been hearing something. The enemy might be nothing more than a lone sniper out there, so he began transmitting the information to the others. Sophia realized this was her only chance. She broke free from his grasp, but Sez kicked her in the leg, asking where she thought she was going. Her job was to serve as his human shield. He then stabbed her with the knife, saying that abandoning her position was unacceptable. His molar clicked once again. Sez asked if they could hear him. There was a sniper at grid E13, between the hill and a cluster of bushes. Unfortunately for the enemy, the morning sun had given away his position, so eliminate every insect in the area. A helicopter immediately began moving. Sez asked if she really thought a coward firing from a distance was truly powerful. Snipers have spotters, suppliers, and support teams to help them escape, all so they can survive a little longer. If they miss, their position will be exposed, and their offensive capability will be neutralized. He continued rambling that a coward who came alone to rescue her would soon be found among the corpses. A lone sniper was nothing more than a target waiting to be shot. But George suddenly leaped down from a tree and said he completely agreed. Sez spun around in shock, only for his head to be severed and sent flying through the air. His headless body collapsed to the ground. George explained that the sniper fire had been deliberate, making them believe the attack came from that direction so they wouldn't notice he was closing in for melee combat. Sophia burst into tears of relief when she saw George. The protagonist said everything had gone exactly according to plan. He thanked her for revealing their location. It seems Sez had taken advantage of the morning sunlight. Even without a head, he still looked shocked. George added that unfortunately, he wasn't much of a sniper. Walking over to the young woman, he asked, Sophia, are you okay? With wide eyes, she stared at him and let out a faint groan of pain. Then she suddenly burst into tears, catching him completely off guard. He asked her not to make so much noise because enemies might still be nearby, but she ignored him and threw her arms around him. She admitted she had been terrified. Suddenly, George remembered some advice from an old friend. In the flashback, his friend told him, "This is the moment a man proves his worth." During that conversation, his friend advised him to simply hold her in silence. Then he added that if everything went well, she might even sleep with him. Back in the flashback, George called his friend's advice complete nonsense. He told his friend to focus on tactics, instead of ridiculous fantasies. Returning to the present, he remembered the advice. Just quietly hold her. He also remembered his friend's hopelessly warped view of the situation. He paused for a moment, looking down with a troubled expression. He wondered if putting his hand on her back would make it seem like he had improper intentions. While he hesitated, the young woman continued sobbing in his arms. Not knowing what to do, his hand hovered awkwardly in the air, completely indecisive. Even though he was a combat genius known as the God of War, he was utterly helpless whenever it came to anything unrelated to fighting. Clinging tightly to him, she kept crying and hugged him even harder. Feeling completely awkward, he froze at her sudden closeness. Then, a deafening roar from the sky caught both of their attention. Looking up, he spotted a helicopter rushing straight toward them. He shouted for her to get down, pushed her to the ground to shield her as a hail of bullets rained down. The helicopter pinned them down in the forest. To keep her safe, he pulled her behind a large boulder. He realized the enemy had finally found his position, but a bullet struck his leg, making him groan. He realized there was no time left. Without a moment's hesitation, he lifted her into his arms and started running. Caught off guard by being picked up, she cried out in confusion and told him to wait. He only shouted back, "Hold on tight." As he ran, he warned her not to make a sound. When they reached the edge of the cliff, he jumped off with her in his arms. In sheer panic, she let out a piercing scream as the two of them fell together, plunging straight into the raging river below. From high above, the fall seemed endless, until they finally hit the water. He held her tightly, bracing both of them for the unavoidable impact. The shock forced her eyes shut, and she finally lost consciousness. Sometime later, she slowly opened her eyes with a groan. Sitting by the riverbank, she finally seemed to recover from the terror, silently looking around. As she tried to process everything that had happened, carrying an armful of firewood, George returned and asked if she was awake. He said he was going to start a fire and told her to get some rest. A little embarrassed, she replied that she was fine. He explained that he had followed the river, and they had probably shaken off anyone pursuing them. He added that they needed to recover their strength. He warned her that they would be leaving soon. By his estimate, it was about half a day's walk back to camp. With a gentle smile, she interrupted him and simply thanked him for saving her. Looking down at the water, he replied that he had only done what anyone should do. She looked slightly flustered by his answer and covered her mouth with her hand. Wanting to help, she stood up and offered to gather food or firewood. But suddenly, her expression turned to complete shock as she looked back. She noticed his body and froze in place. Seeing her fixed gaze, he also became awkward about the situation. Taking a step back, she hugged herself and let out an embarrassed yelp. Her foot caught on a branch lying on the ground. Losing her balance completely, she fell toward him. As they collided, she cried out in pain with her eyes tightly shut. When she opened them, she realized she had fallen right on top of him. George was stunned by the position they were in. She wondered what she was supposed to do. In such an awkward situation, she told herself that her strength seemed to be fading. She was completely exhausted. In the end, she simply leaned against him on the ground, trying to steady herself. George reminded himself that he was a soldier and had to resist. As they moved closer, their faces were only inches apart. He realized he could no longer stop. What was about to happen? He pulled her close, and they kissed. The two finally gave in to the moment. They were alone in the middle of the forest, but a sudden noise interrupted everything, putting them both on high alert. In one swift motion, he shouted for her to get down and pushed her to the ground. The next instant, he drew his weapon and aimed into the darkness of the forest. With a focused expression, he kept his aim steady, ready for any threat. Behind him, she could only watch everything unfold, waiting to see what would happen. Suddenly, a small squirrel darted out of the bushes. Seeing the little animal, he realized it had been a false alarm and lowered his gun. He told her not to worry, saying they no longer needed to stay on guard. But when he turned back, he noticed something and looked slightly confused. The two stood there in silence, not knowing what to say. Feeling awkward, she apologized for what had happened between them. Turning away, he said she had probably been overwhelmed by everything. He explained that it was simply a stress response, one that caused confusion and irrational behavior. Saying she was just exhausted, he told her to get some more rest. After hearing his explanation, she looked like she couldn't believe what he had just said. With an irritated tone, she called him a complete amateur. Then she stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. Suddenly, she grabbed his face with both hands, catching him off guard. Clearly annoyed, she asked who he thought he was to diagnose her like that. Completely confused, he asked what she meant by diagnose. He insisted he had only stated the facts. She immediately shouted at him to stop being an idiot. He admitted it was a stress reaction, but he was still confused, asking, "Then what was it? If it wasn't caused by stress?" After a brief silence, her expression completely changed. As she stared straight into his eyes, with unwavering conviction, she finally confessed that what she felt for him was love. Still holding his face, she realized he was the legendary soldier, George Tsisai. She said he was a genius master of close-quarters combat. The scene shifted, showing him effortlessly dodging an attack at point-blank range. He could even perceive an opponent's line of fire, allowing him to dodge bullets. Compared to his reflexes, Sophia's movement toward him, it was almost imperceptibly slow to a soldier like him. It was a speed, far slower than the punch of an experienced boxer. It was also incomparably slower than a shot fired from an M1911 pistol. To him, it was practically standing still. The two finally stood face to face at close range. Then, without the slightest hesitation, she finally kissed him in the middle of that clearing. But this time, George didn't dodge the unexpected attack. From a nearby tree branch, a squirrel quietly watched the strange scene unfold. Unlike before, he could no longer stop what was happening between them. The story then shifted back to 30 days earlier. The scene revealed George's final mission. Startled awake, a young man found himself in a very unfamiliar place. Sitting up in bed, he realized his body was restrained by all kinds of strange straps. He looked down at himself, trying to understand what was happening. Completely bewildered, he shouted, "Where am I?" At that moment, a woman appeared, looking surprised to see that he was awake while stirring a pot. She remarked that he had finally come to. Turning toward him, the woman asked how he was feeling. With a stunned expression, he recognized her and asked, "Are you Sophia?" But after taking a closer look, he realized something was terribly wrong. Another woman then appeared, warning him not to get up because he had lost too much blood. On a tray, nearby, several surgical instruments lay on the table. She was holding a scalpel. She said that under normal circumstances, there was no way he should be conscious yet. He simply stared at her, completely confused by the bizarre situation. She then dipped the tip of the scalpel into a small vial of liquid. With a swift flick, she sprayed the substance toward him. Feeling a sudden jolt, he began struggling violently on the bed. The restraints around his wrists and ankles held him tightly despite his desperate attempts to break free. No matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't escape the restraints. Letting out a soft chuckle, the woman warned him that trying to escape the trap was pointless. She then explained that not even a bear could break free from those reinforced restraints. They had been specially strengthened. She then compared him to a fish on a cutting board. With a smile, she told him to act like a fish and quietly let himself be filleted. Grinding his teeth, he glared at her with burning rage. Using all his strength, he struggled against the restraints, binding his wrists. She reminded him that not even a bear could escape those reinforced restraints. Comparing him to a fish, she warned that he was already lying on the cutting board while she held the scalpel. Raising the surgical knife, she ordered him to behave like a fish and stay still. Clenching his teeth, he shot her a furious glare. He shouted in desperation, saying the restraints wouldn't budge at all. She walked toward him. She seemed completely unfazed by his struggle. Still lying on the bed, he asked if she was acting under someone's orders. Suddenly, a terrifying suspicion crossed his mind about the mastermind behind all this. The image of a sinister man flashed through his head. He wondered if this was Akachi's doing. He demanded to know what they planned to do with him. When he repeated the name Akachi, she fell silent for a moment. Believing he was right, he convinced himself he had known it all along, but she looked confused and asked who that was, leaving him stunned by her reaction. Picking up the tray of instruments, she apologized for introducing herself so late. She introduced herself, saying her name was Rin, and that she was a doctor. He asked if she really was a doctor, clearly sounding skeptical. She explained that she was about to begin surgery to remove the bullet. She went on to explain that there was a bullet lodged in his right thigh. She warned that the bullet would deteriorate and cause severe poisoning. With a serious expression, she declared that removing it was absolutely necessary. He could only lie there in silence. He listened carefully to her explanation. She then warned him that she had some bad news, and some very good news. Unfortunately, she admitted they had no anesthesia, so the surgery would be extremely painful. She explained that was why. He had been tied down so he could struggle as much as he wanted. Curious, he asked what the good news was. Introducing herself, she said she was a doctor with Doctors Without Borders. She explained that she was used to procedures like this. Winking at him, she told him to trust her without fear. Repeating the organization's name, he said he had heard of it before. Clapping her hands together, she announced that the pre-operative briefing was now complete. Requesting verbal consent, she asked whether he agreed to the proposed treatment. With a serious expression, he simply replied that he refused. Completely stunned, she could only ask what he had just said. She warned him that this was no time for jokes. She insisted the surgery had to begin immediately. He asked if she hadn't heard him, repeating that he refused to consent to any of it. He then ordered her to untie him. If she understood what he had just said, she shouted, asking if he was crazy, warning him that he could die. Calmly, he replied that he understood all the risks. Then he said he would remove the bullet himself because he had learned how to do it in the military. Calling the idea absurd, she yelled that there was already a doctor standing right in front of him, but he questioned her abilities, saying there was no concrete proof that she was qualified. Furious that he doubted her, he asked whether she had any way to prove it. She had no answer. She apologized and fell completely silent. He then stated that he would never entrust his life to a complete stranger. Hearing those words, she was left utterly speechless. With a worried expression, she tried to justify herself, but in the end she hesitated. She explained that, as a doctor, she could not operate on a patient under those circumstances. He simply stared at her as she began, talking about medical ethics. She concluded by saying that performing medical treatment without a patient's consent was strictly forbidden. Then he challenged her to follow her own rules and untie him. With tears welling up in her eyes, she finally seemed to give in to her patient's request. Walking over, she began loosening the restraints that bound him to the bed. After freeing him, she walked over to a corner and hung up her lab coat. Standing at a distance, she silently watched him. Sitting up, he let out a sigh and asked to borrow a scalpel. Without saying a word, she turned to retrieve the surgical instrument. She stepped closer and placed the sharp blade directly into his hand. but in one swift motion, he grabbed her wrist, twisted the weapon around, and with tears in her eyes, she stared at him, completely shocked by his sudden action. Pressing the scalpel against her neck, he pinned her down on the bed. Shouting, he desperately demanded to know what she thought she was doing. The story flashed back. She had said she couldn't act, without a patient's consent. Breaking that rule, she cried, would cost her the right to call herself a doctor. Even with the blade at her throat, she still tried to persuade him. Through her tears, she desperately shouted that there was a patient right in front of her, and to her, giving up now would mean she was no longer a doctor. Remembering Sophia, he recalled her saying that she wanted to save people. As that memory resurfaced, his expression completely changed with a sudden realization. He then said he wanted to add one special clause to the consent form. His proposal was that the two of them would place complete trust in each other. He said that he was also placing his own life in her hands. Letting out a brief laugh, he seemed to find the whole situation strangely amusing. Completely bewildered, she shouted, asking what was so funny. He began explaining that the most terrifying enemy on the battlefield was someone willing to throw away their own life. He said that anyone prepared to risk everything for a clear purpose would become incredibly powerful. As she stared at him with tear-filled eyes, he suddenly did something unexpected and licked the sharp blade. Pointing the scalpel toward her, he simply said that he surrendered. With a smile, he told her that he would place his complete trust in her surgery. Calling her doctor, he left her utterly stunned by his decision. Closing her eyes for a moment, she finally seemed to accept his choice. With a wink, she said she accepted the responsibility and would do everything she could to help. However, she reminded him that, as she had mentioned earlier, there was no anesthesia on the island. She warned him that the procedure would be unimaginably painful. Using a pair of scissors, she began cutting away the bandages to expose the wound. She instructed him not to move, because the femoral artery was dangerously close. Nodding, he said he fully understood her warning. Completely focused, she prepared for the delicate operation. Raising her hand, she finally announced that she was about to begin the surgery. With remarkable precision, she made the first incision in his leg. Maintaining her concentration, she carefully continued working to remove the bullet. Her eyes remained fixed on the wound, never losing her focus. Remaining perfectly still, he endured the agony without letting out a single groan. Amazed by his endurance, she said he was truly incredible. She explained that she had removed bullets from countless patients before. Recalling those previous cases, she knew that even the toughest soldiers would scream when a bullet was removed. Was simply impossible to endure. No one could remain unfazed by such excruciating pain. But he explained that pain could be suppressed through proper training. He said it was possible to endure almost any form of torture. Astonished, she wondered what kind of training could achieve something like that. As she continued treating his wound, she couldn't stop thinking about his incredible endurance. She found herself fascinated by him. She could only wonder what kind of person he really was. She suddenly remembered his words that the most terrifying enemy on the battlefield was someone willing to throw away their own life. After reaching a conclusion, she remarked that appearances could truly be deceiving. She had assumed he was from this island. She asked if he was a former soldier. Instead, he asked whether his past had anything to do with the surgery they were performing right now. Feeling a little embarrassed, she admitted he was right and apologized. He continued watching her as she turned away. Then, noticing something, he commented that everything felt strangely familiar. He said the more he looked at her, the more she reminded him of Sophia. After a brief silence, he simply watched her. Then he asked why someone from Doctors Without Borders would come to a place like this. With a serious expression, she stared at him without answering immediately. Eventually, she admitted that she was searching for a certain man somewhere around the area. Hearing her answer, he asked who the man she was looking for was. Her mind suddenly drifted back into a horrifying moment from her dark past. In that memory, someone called her name as she screamed in despair. A blood-covered face begged her to remember. Then Azinistaman said that true art demanded a great sacrifice. Returning to the present, she looked at him with determination and picked up another surgical instrument to continue the procedure. Letting out a sigh, she seemed slightly more at ease. With a smile, she announced that she had found the bullet and was about to remove it. Lying on the bed, he gave her permission to begin the procedure. With the instrument in hand, she finally began operating on his leg. The scene changed, and some time appeared to have passed since the delicate surgery. Outside the cabin, he seemed to be recovering well. Sitting on the ground with a crutch, he let out a deep sigh. Standing up, he remarked that his strength seemed to be returning. He tested his injured leg, but suddenly, he looked to the side and said something felt off. She simply jumped down from the porch and walked over to where he was standing. With a smile, She warned him that he still needed more rest. Thanking her for everything she had done, he promised to repay everything he owed her. She said everything was fine now, but with a smile, she added that he only needed to pay what he owed. Completely confused, he asked what she meant. Holding out her hand, she began, listing the surgery and hospitalization fees. With a wide grin, she revealed that the total came to 548,000 yen. He froze in shock. All he could do was shout, asking what she had just said. He thanked her again for saving him and promised to repay every cent. Smiling, she told him not to worry about it, but then added that everything would be fine as long as he paid what he owed. Holding out her hand again, she started listing the costs of the surgery and hospital stay. She then revealed that the final bill totaled 548,000 yen. Completely stunned, he yelled in disbelief at the outrageous amount she was charging. The scene shifted, bringing the story to a place filled with blooming cherry blossoms. Arriving at a large gate, he approached the 2 guards standing watch at the entrance. Looking around, he thought the entire place was absolutely breathtaking. Inside, a bustling street, it was packed with people enjoying a local festival. As he walked through the area, several couples enjoyed the district's romantic atmosphere. From above, the lively streetscape unfolded before them, revealed the beauty of the entire city. Amazed, he wondered how a place like this could exist on Grummers, an island made of garbage. It was known as the Paradise of Desire, the Flower District. As he approached the gate, he stopped before 2 guards in black suits. One of the guards turned around and asked what he wanted there. Taking a few more steps, he stopped and stared silently at the 2 men. With a grin, one of them asked if he knew what kind of place this was. He calmly replied, saying he was just a customer looking for something. He declared that he had come to buy a woman. The story flashed back as he asked the doctor whether she charged patients for her work. After hearing her answer, he said he understood now and admitted he had been mistaken. Confused, she asked what mistake he was talking about. He explained that he had assumed it was charity, because she worked for Doctors Without Borders. Summing up his thoughts, he said that, to her, medicine was ultimately a business. Shocked, she immediately started yelling at him, angrily trying to defend herself. She shouted that medical equipment and procedures were extremely expensive, especially on an island like this. He replied that he didn't think charging patients was wrong, because she deserved to be compensated. She then asked whether he actually had the money to pay the bill. At that moment, he remembered a man begging desperately over money. In that memory, the man, screaming in despair, his face covered in blood. With a serious expression, he prepared to answer her question. He said he truly wanted to pay, but unfortunately, he didn't have any money right now. He bluntly concluded that paying her at the moment was simply impossible. Completely stunned, she stared at him, unable to believe what she had just heard. Pressing a hand to her forehead, she said he was the first person who had ever told her that. She then began explaining what would happen if he couldn't pay. Letting out a sigh, she seemed to decide on the best way to resolve the situation. She then proposed an infiltration mission to gather important intelligence. Skeptical of the proposal, he asked what the objective of such a mission was. Kneeling down, she revealed that the man she had been hunting was inside that district. With a grim expression, she told him he simply had to kill that man. With a serious look, he calmly said he understood the entire plan. Letting out a sigh of relief, she said that helped, then explained that only certain women were allowed to enter. However, as a man, he could enter as a customer, without arousing any suspicion. He silently processed everything he had just learned. Looking back at her, he asked if this had been her plan from the very beginning. With a wink, she simply replied, "Maybe," and welcomed him aboard. With a determined gaze, he stared at her without saying a word. Back in the present, one of the guards asked if he had come to buy a woman. The 2 guards stared at him, unable to believe what they had just heard. Then they burst into laughter, mocking his filthy appearance. Completely unfazed, he continued staring at the 2 men with a serious expression. One of them remarked that he looked like a slave miner with a lot of nerve. The other said that if he really was a customer, that would be a different story, so he demanded a deposit to prove he was a legitimate client. With an arrogant expression, he warned that the women here were all high class and required a financial guarantee. The guard explained that he needed money just to get inside. Without it, they would assume he was just there to gawk and throw him out. They shouted threateningly, mockingly calling him a VIP once again. He simply looked back at the 2 of them, without saying a word. Letting out a sigh, he prepared himself for what was about to happen. Turning toward the guards, he admitted that he didn't have any money, but with a determined expression, he warned them that he would get in one way or another. Hearing that, the 2 guards became furious at his audacity. One of them shouted, calling him a penniless bum, while the other sneered, saying this wouldn't end well for him. Yelling in his face, the two charged at him at the same time. He reacted instantly, defending himself against attacks from both sides. To counter them, he dropped the crutch and blocked one of the incoming strikes. Then he used one of the guards as a foothold to flip backward through the air. Twisting his body, he landed perfectly on one of the thug's shoulders. Without wasting a second, he delivered a precise strike straight to the guard's neck below. Caught completely off guard, the man staggered to the side. Before he could recover, George grabbed him from behind and began twisting his neck. His technique exploited the cervical vertebrae's weakness against sudden rotational force. With a sharp twist, he applied maximum force at roughly a 50-degree angle. His eyes narrowed as he prepared to finish his opponent. In one swift motion, he completed the twist and snapped the man's neck. Using explosive strength, he hurled the body aside with a single movement. Then he revealed the first rule of fighting two opponents at once. Seeing his partner collapse, the remaining guards screamed and rushed toward the body. George explained that the first rule was to eliminate one opponent immediately. Then he continued, "The second rule is that your opponent will never do what you want." He deliberately provoked the remaining guard, pointing out that the weak one was already dead. The guard roared in fury, his eyes burning with hatred. Completely enraged, the man shouted, calling George a bastard. At that moment, George knew his opponent would definitely attack. Consumed by rage, the guard charged forward, throwing wild punches, with no control whatsoever. His movements were completely predictable. George effortlessly blocked the attack, took advantage of the opening, sidestepped, and prepared a swift, precise counterattack. With a devastating punch, he drove all his strength into the guard's face. The impact sent the man flying backward. He was completely knocked out by the clean strike, collapsing to the ground, his face covered in blood as he lay motionless. At that very moment, a scream echoed through the street, drawing everyone's attention. Seeing the bodies on the ground, a woman cried out in horror, shouting that someone had been murdered. A crowd quickly gathered, confirming that what she said was true. George then remembered a warning he had received not long ago. In that flashback, the guards had asked whether he was even listening to them. Then, he remembered that the doctor had also given him an important warning. She had told him not to cause any trouble in the flower district. The reason was that the place didn't welcome men who lacked proper manners. According to her, it was a place reserved for true gentlemen who knew the rules. Returning to the memory, the other guards had said the gates would only open for those who qualified. George then wondered whether taking down the guards would cause problems here. But one of the guards replied that he'd never find out if he didn't keep his mouth shut. Shouting, the guard charged forward with his fist raised high, ready to strike. George simply told the guard to shut up and stared him down. With his glasses cracked, the man looked confused by George's reaction. He wondered what was wrong with this scrawny kid. Then suddenly, George appeared before him like a towering, terrifying giant. Saying he understood, George slammed his crutch into the ground. He then announced that he would back down today, leaving the guards bewildered. With a smile, he said he was doing it because he was a gentleman. The two guards were left speechless, simply watching the scene unfold. Turning his back, he slowly began walking away from the guards. Before leaving, he cast one final glance at the place. Looking at the surrounding walls, he said he now understood the layout. He realized the city was surrounded by walls with only a single entrance. He concluded that it would be foolish to infiltrate without understanding the structure inside. But suddenly, he noticed something and let out a quiet gasp. Looking back, he spotted a young boy quickly pushing a cart toward him. Stopping in front of him, the boy asked in surprise, "Mikio, is that you?" Turning around, he recognized the boy and asked, "Kyo." Calling out his name, the boy ran toward him with a smile. With a leap, he happily jumped onto Mikio's back and hugged him tightly. The boy asked where he had been all this time. He said Mikio had suddenly disappeared, so he had been searching everywhere for him. Poking him in the side, the boy told him never to make him worry like that again. He then asked what Mikio was doing in a place like this. Resting a hand on his chin, Mikio replied that he was just there to buy a woman. Completely stunned, the boy stared at him with eyes wide in disbelief. Then he started shouting, unable to believe what he had just heard. He kept yelling, unable to understand what had happened to his friend. Then he cried out that his friend was never the kind of person to say something like that. With tears welling up in his eyes, he said that Mikio had always been a kind-hearted person. His mind drifted back to the past. He said his friend was a good person. Still crying, the boy begged him not to say such strange things anymore. After thinking for a moment, he said there might be another way to get inside. Then he told the boy that he had an idealized image of Mikio. With tears in his eyes, the boy quietly listened to what he had to say. He then warned him that, unfortunately, he couldn't become the ideal Mikio the boy imagined. The boy stared at him, shocked by what he had just heard. He continued, saying he was thinking about his next strategy, and asked the boy not to interfere. After a moment of silent frustration, the boy reluctantly agreed. He admitted that George was right, and that Mikio was a man too. He went on to say that men have desires they can't always control. With a wink, the boy warned that if he saw him, he would pretend not to know him. George stared at the boy, realizing he had completely misunderstood the situation. Covering his ears, the boy told him to change the subject and get back to work. As he pushed the cart forward, he continued muttering about his friend. Stopping him, George asked what was inside the cart. Pointing at it, the boy explained what he was transporting. He said it contained bed sheets, laundry, and various hygiene supplies. With a smile, the boy explained that he took care of the courtesan's daily necessities. Hearing that, George suddenly had an idea, and his expression completely changed. He remarked that this made things much easier, leaving the boy confused. Smiling, George said he could get inside by hiding in Kyo's supply cart. Horrified by the idea, the boy cried out in despair, unable to believe what he had just proposed. Looking at the tarp, George remarked that there seemed to be enough room for one person. Trying to stop him, the boy shouted that this was obviously a terrible idea. Confused, George asked why, making the boy even angrier. The boy shouted that he would never help him and refused to get involved. George explained that he couldn't get through the front gate without paying the required deposit. Chuckling softly, the boy said he wouldn't accomplish anything in there anyway. Letting out a sigh of relief, the boy said he had completely forgotten about that and asked how much was needed. In a serious tone, George replied that he needed at least 500,000 yen. Spreading both arms, the boy said he had never seen that much money in his entire life. At that moment, George began devising a plan to make use of Kyo. Smiling, he said he had come up with an interesting idea regarding Masa's inheritance. Startled, the boy asked if he meant that Masa. George then revealed that Masa had died. The boy was utterly shocked. With a sly smile, George said Masa had left all of his money to him. The boy stared at him, trying to figure out what he was planning. He asked if the plan was to use Masa's inheritance as the deposit. Smiling, George said there was no other way to get into the district. Speechless, the boy simply stared at him, completely stunned by how cold-hearted he sounded. George then added that there was no way to find Masa's younger sister. He said the money would serve a better purpose if used this way. Furious, the boy stomped the ground with all his strength. Grabbing George, he desperately shouted, telling him to abandon that idea immediately. Through tears, he begged George not to use Masa's inheritance for something like this, saying that doing something so heartless was absolutely wrong. Silently, George looked at a cherry blossom tree, thinking over the entire situation. With a faint smile, he admitted that Kyo was absolutely right, catching the boy by surprise. So George proposed a new deal so they could reach an agreement. He promised not to touch the inheritance if Kyo helped him. He asked if that sounded like a fair deal, then waited for the boy's answer. Clenching his teeth, Kyo seemed to weigh the offer. George simply watched him, patiently waiting for his final decision. Suddenly, the boy smiled and said that the idea was actually pretty good. Pointing at the supply cart, Kyo said George could hide inside and relax completely. With a sigh, George apologized to Kyo, saying it was all for the mission. That district was a flourishing paradise hidden in the middle of the slums. He believed the key to escaping the island was hidden there. His soldier's instincts told him that something important was waiting inside. As Kyo pushed the cart, he looked deeply worried about the whole situation. Reaching the entrance, he once again faced the two guards at the gate. Hidden inside the cart, George quietly told Kyo not to be nervous and to act naturally. Kyo asked who he was talking to, then told George to leave everything to him. Seeing the boy, the guards looked surprised as he approached. Waving, Kyo greeted the guards with a cheerful hello. Hidden inside, George remained silent, simply observing Kyo's interaction. One of the guards recognized him and called him Kyo. The young errand boy hurried forward. Kyo asked them to let him through quickly, but the two guards stepped in front of him, completely blocking his path. Surprised by their behavior, Kyo simply stared at them, unable to understand what was happening. One of the guards then informed him that, whether he entered or not, was entirely up to them. Trying to get through, Kyo argued that they already knew him and asked to be let in. But the guards ignored his request and decided to thoroughly inspect the cart. Furious, Kyo shouted, asking why, since they had never searched him before. Hearing that, one guard roughly grabbed him by the collar and told him to shut up. The man asked whether he had something to hide. Losing his patience, the guard violently threw Kyo to the ground without hesitation. After knocking him down, the man walked over and began lifting the tarp, pulling back the cover. He was about to inspect the contents of the cart. Hidden inside, George silently stared at the guard, waiting to be discovered. Lying on the ground, Kyo realized he had made a mistake by acting too nervously. Seeing the guard become suspicious, he rushed over and tried to stop him from searching the cart. For George, this moment was a crucial test of his entire plan. With one swift motion, the guard ripped the tarp off the cart. To his surprise, he found nothing inside except supplies. That was exactly what George had anticipated and prepared for. Examining the cargo, the guard carefully inspected every item, much to Kyo's annoyance. Picking up a saw, he asked why it was mixed in with the supplies. Kyo explained that it was one of the tools he used for his daily work. The guard then ran the saw across his hand to test its sharpness. Using those tools, George had built a hidden compartment inside the cart. With a false bottom, he was able to conceal himself completely underneath. Lying inside the compartment, he simply waited for the guard to finish the inspection. The story flashed back, showing what had happened an hour earlier. At that time, Kyo had been complaining, telling George not to ruin his work tools. George noticed that the cart was falling apart and offered to repair it. Delighted, Kyo thanked him and immediately accepted his friend's help. Back in the present, the guard said there was nothing suspicious. The other guard agreed and looked up at the sky, seemingly lost in thought. At last, they opened the gate and shouted that Kyo could pass. Kyo pulled the tarp back into place, covering George once again. He then passed through the gate, pushing the cart into the district. Once they were inside, George said the whole ordeal had been incredibly tense. Annoyed, Kyo said he had done everything he could to avoid raising any suspicion. Smiling, George thanked Kyo, saying they had made it inside. Embarrassed, Kyo stared at him, surprised by the sudden gratitude, and asked what that was for. He said he hadn't done anything special. Saying he had to get back to work, the boy prepared to leave. Before running off, he shouted for Mikio to remember their promise. Closing his eyes, George simply nodded and said he understood. He asked for the name of the courtesan Kyo worked for. With a wink, Kyo said she was one of the 4 great courtesans. Hearing her name, George fell silent for a moment, deep in thought. Kyo told him to go home, said goodbye, and left. Now alone, George celebrated successfully infiltrating the flower district. Recalling his mission, he remembered that he needed to find a certain man. He recalled that the man's name was Kenjaki. Realizing he had very little information, he knew he needed to come up with a new plan. Leaning on his crutch, he decided to walk around the district and investigate. Along the streets, wealthy men strolled beside beautiful women. As he wandered through the city, he carefully surveyed the entire area. He knew these streets were shaped by history and culture rather than logic. For him, taking in the city's atmosphere with all 5 senses was essential. Observing the buildings, he noticed a consistent pattern in their construction. He saw that each block contained 5 rooms with nearly identical entrances. A woman sat at each doorway, welcoming potential customers. On the other hand, he noticed that some rooms were currently closed. Watching the flow of people, he realized many rooms were shut, yet the district was still surprisingly busy, even during the day. Passing through a courtyard, he saw that the open rooms were few and scattered. Looking into one of the rooms, he noticed the woman on the left had no customers. In the room on the right, another woman also appeared to be waiting for a client, offering customers a choice. He turned back to choose one of the rooms. As his first step, he decided which woman to approach first. Without hesitation, he walked straight toward the room on the left. Politely asking for permission, he said he had something he wanted to ask her. She looked up with a serious yet curious expression. Standing before her, he waited for a response to his approach. With a faint smile, she seemed amused by the unusual situation. She then informed him that they did not accept first-time customers. Hearing that for the first time, he asked, confused, what that policy meant. An older woman then appeared and explained that persistent men were not welcome there. Turning away, he seemed to give up, yet he remained standing there. Repeating the phrase to himself, he still couldn't grasp its exact meaning. Several women began repeating that they did not accept first-time customers. One of them walked over and apologized, once again emphasizing the house rules. Another woman repeated the same phrase with an awkward smile. From behind, another female voice politely refused to serve him. A different woman, standing in the shadows, also said that first-time customers were troublesome. Unable to understand the rule, George stood there trying to make sense of the bizarre situation. Frustrated, he shouted, asking what the hell a first-time customer was. Suddenly, a loud scream nearby caught his attention. Someone in the crowd was shouting for a man to let Miss Kusuzu go. Turning toward the commotion, he heard cries for help nearby. A man was holding a woman hostage, threatening to kill her if anyone came closer. People in the crowd shouted for him to stop, saying violence was forbidden. Mocking them, the man said they had become far too arrogant. He declared that he had given Kusuzu everything, yet she still rejected him. Holding a knife to her throat, he yelled that this was nothing more than a pleasure district. One of the men replied that it was entirely his own fault, because he wasn't a regular customer. The man shouted back that this entire city was one giant scam. Enraged, he cursed the place, calling it a filthy slum. Witnessing the chaos, George silently observed everything unfolding before him. The man said that at this rate, he would end up as a slave miner. The moment George heard the words slave miner, his expression completely changed. He remembered that the men who were exploited here were all eventually sent there. In despair, the man asked the woman if she wanted to die there with him. Unsure what to do, the crowd panicked. Furious, one of the men said he wouldn't let those insults go unanswered. A woman made her way through the crowd, telling everyone to step aside. The men recognized her and cried out in surprise, "Lady Rog." George then remembered that she was Kyo's employer. Filled with menace, the hostage-taker shouted for her not to come any closer, or he would kill the hostage. He continued yelling, asking if she had heard his threat. She stopped directly in front of him, and silently stared him down for a moment. Then, without warning, she struck him with her fan, leaving him completely stunned. With a look of contempt, she called him a pathetic loser, saying he couldn't even behave like a proper customer. The men remarked that this was the usual behavior of men who threaten courtesans. George simply watched, knowing it was a typical story in this world. She said that any man who could only make threats without the courage to act had no right to wound their pride, and told him to either act or leave. With a resolute gaze, she ordered him to quietly leave the city. Terrified, the man shouted for the men in suits to come help him. She ordered her people to capture him, but they hesitated, too afraid to act. They said the man was armed with a sharp knife. Surprised, she asked if they were serious. Unable to believe their cowardice, the hostage-taker flew into a rage. The man shouted at her to stop mocking him and tightened his grip on the knife. He charged forward, screaming that she would die right there. With the knife pointed at her, he closed the distance, ready to strike. But in the blink of an eye, someone stepped in to protect her. In one swift motion, George lunged forward and blocked the man's attack. Grabbing the fan, he used it to shield himself from the blade. Pulling her behind him, he saved her from the incoming attack of the enraged assailant. Startled, she could only stare at him, shocked by his sudden intervention. Grabbing the man's arm, George used his strength to stop the attack. With a grip like steel, he locked onto the attacker's wrist. Subduing the man, he disarmed him and glared at him with a stern expression. Slamming the man to the ground, he pinned him there as the attacker screamed in pain. Astonished by George's actions, she could only stand there, unsure how to react. The bodyguards, and everyone in place, the crowd were stunned by the sudden turn of events. Holding up the knife, George said he had the situation under control and asked if they had handcuffs. The bodyguard stepped forward and took the attacker away. As he screamed for them to let him go, kneeling down, the young woman apologized for putting her mistress in danger. Comforting her, the lady said, she simply couldn't tolerate being insulted like that. She warned that this place created desperate people, so they had to stay vigilant. With a smile, the young woman nodded and promised to be more careful. Turning to George, the lady seemed eager to discuss what had just happened. Thanking him for his help, she asked whether he knew martial arts. He replied that it was something along those lines. She praised his impressive techniques, then looked over his clothes, and asked if he was an errand boy. Closing his eyes, he replied that he wasn't an errand boy. With a serious expression, he declared that he was simply a customer looking for some entertainment. Surprised, she remarked that he was a customer after all. Turning back, she called to him and asked him to follow her. Not understanding, he simply stared at her, puzzled by the sudden invitation. With a smile, she said she was inviting him to her private room. He continued staring at her with a serious expression, showing no reaction whatsoever. Meanwhile, the street sweeper let out a sigh, looking rather bored. He complained that Mikio was trying to have fun without any money. Annoyed, he shouted that it was far too soon for that. Then he added that without cash, Mikio wouldn't be getting any entertainment anyway. With a smile, he said he would cook Mikio a delicious meal instead. Just then, Lady Yoshi called for him and warned that a customer was waiting. The boy smiled and answered, calling her Lady Yoshi. When he saw the two of them walking together, he was completely caught off guard. Unable to understand what was happening, the boy cried out in shock as he saw Mikio with his mistress. After entering the room, the two sat down to talk in private. Peeking through the door, the boy told them to enjoy their time together. Sitting across from each other, they silently stared at one another for a while. The boy wondered why Mikio was with Lady Yoshi. Holding out her hands, she beckoned him to come sit beside her. Taking a sip of tea, George simply looked at her without any visible reaction. She told him to do whatever he wanted. Lifting the edge of her kimono, she teasingly flirted with him. Watching through the doorway, the boy reacted in shock at the sight. Then he hurried away. The boy said it was time to clean the room. George picked up his teacup and calmly observed her. Then, he asked if this was her way of thanking him for saving her. She replied that he had saved her life and that this was a small price to pay. Hearing that, George stood up with his crutch and walked toward her. As he drew closer, he sat down directly in front of the mysterious woman. Without the slightest hesitation, he firmly placed his hand on her thigh. She stared back at him, her expression unchanged despite his bold move. He slowly began sliding his hand up her leg, but suddenly stopped and pulled it back. He apologized and revealed his true intention. He admitted that he had lied about being an ordinary customer. He then asked if she would answer a few questions, as a way of thanking him. Letting out a breath, she smiled faintly at the unexpected turn of events. Amused, she clearly enjoyed how things had unfolded. With a serious expression, she said she had known from the beginning that he wasn't a customer. Closing her fan, she told him he had passed the test she had prepared. Confused, he asked what test she was talking about. Curious, he also asked how she knew he wasn't a customer. Smiling, she replied that the answer was simple. Opening her fan, she explained that the secret lay in the bracelet on his wrist. She said that official customers were given a wristband as proof of payment. Without it, a person would be treated as a suspicious and potentially dangerous intruder. She then revealed that saying they didn't accept first-time customers was simply a polite way to turn someone away. After hearing this, George said he finally understood how everything worked in this district. She then explained that it took a great deal of money to enjoy the pleasures of this city. When a customer entered, they first paid at an automated machine, just for the privilege of speaking with the courtesans. The machine would swallow one bill every 5 minutes. She said customers had to endure the horror of watching their money disappear. She admitted the entire system was an outrageous scam. George remained silent, processing all the new information. With a serious expression, he said that was exactly how customers like that were created. Covering her mouth with her fan, she agreed with his conclusion. She explained that every customer started out as a regular client who wasn't allowed to touch the courtesans. Only after meeting certain requirements would they be promoted to priority status. Kneeling beside him, she explained that only at that level were they allowed greater intimacy. She concluded by saying that only priority customers were permitted to share a bed with them. Surprised by the system, George looked at her curiously and remarked that he found it hard to believe people would actually pay for such a scam. Closing her fan, she seemed to reflect on the district's situation. With a serious expression, she said that wasn't the only reason. George remained silent, waiting for her to elaborate. He then asked what kind of people these wealthy customers were. With her fan covering her face, she revealed that most of them came from the mainland. A look of surprise crossed his face, as if he had just made an important discovery. He asked whether there was any way to leave the island, such as by ship or airplane. Still hiding behind her fan, she apologized and seemed hesitant to answer. She then explained that any information about leaving the island was confidential. Annoyed by the answer, George merely clicked his tongue, unable to press the issue. She then asked if he had finished asking all of his questions. Closing his eyes, he said he had just one final question. He asked if she knew a man named Kenzie, a former doctor. She asked, "Who is Kenzie?" Apparently not recognizing the name. She explained that it would be difficult to find someone there by name alone. After hearing that, George said he understood the situation and fell silent. Smiling, she said it was now her turn to ask a question. Taking his hand, she made an unexpected proposal. With a seductive gaze, she asked if he wanted to become one of hers. Confused, he stared at her, unable to understand what she meant. The next scene showed the end of another chapter of the story. On a makeshift arena, a match was about to begin between two men. Holding her fan, the woman announced the start of the fight. Then George found himself facing a man dressed in black. The reason for the duel remained a mystery that would soon be revealed. Back in the room, George asked what she had meant by her proposal. Correcting herself, she told him to become one of them, not just hers alone. Still confused by the clarification, he looked at her with a puzzled expression. She then revealed that she wanted to recruit him as one of her bodyguards. Shocked by the offer, George was left speechless, simply staring at her. Motioning for him to follow, she stood up and walked across the room. George followed her upstairs to the upper floor of the house. She opened a door, revealing what lay inside. His eyes widened, in surprise at what he saw. The room was an elegant living space, completely unlike anything found in the slums. She explained that the courtesans formed groups of 5 to protect one another. They lived together, in quarters above the gambling houses. Clapping her hands, she gathered everyone's attention for introductions. Hearing her call, all the women of the flower tea group gathered together. Lady Suzu introduced herself and thanked George for helping her earlier on the street. The other two, Bon and John, also introduced themselves while continuing with their work. She then explained that each group was allowed to hire one bodyguard, exclusively. Suddenly, a man burst into the room, shouting for Lady Yoshi. He looked deeply worried. Shocked, he demanded to know why. He had been dismissed from his position. Apologetically, she told him that George would be the new bodyguard. George then pointed out that he hadn't even agreed to take the job yet. Dropping to his knees, the man begged her to reconsider firing him. Looking at the others, she asked if anyone objected to the decision. Smiling, 2 of them said they supported their leader's choice. The other 2 said they were fine with it as well. Desperate, the man begged for one more chance to prove himself. Pointing at George, the man shouted that he would never lose to some skinny nobody. Hiding her face behind her fan, she seemed amused by the situation. One of the women said the man was rather pitiful and deserved one last chance. The man roared that he would crush George and wouldn't hold back, even if he got hurt. With a smile, she pointed at George and declared the match would begin. Thus, the battle for the exclusive bodyguard position finally started. The man charged in with a fierce attack, but George easily dodged it. Using his crutch, he stepped back to evade his opponent's strike. Enraged, the man yelled at him not to get cocky just because he had dodged one attack. George simply stared at his opponent, waiting for his next move. With a shout, the man rushed in again with a flurry of punches, but George avoided every single blow with smooth, effortless movements. As a former soldier, George disliked unnecessary violence in any situation. Roaring in anger, the man launched another desperate assault. He pressed forward with another barrage of attacks, putting everything he had into trying to land a hit. The same principle applied to fights. George always remained calm. He realized that becoming the bodyguard would allow him to stay in the city. The benefits of the job were simply too great for him to ignore. Gripping his crutch tightly, George seemed to have made his final decision about the fight. In one swift motion, he tossed the crutch aside and stepped forward. Spotting an opening, the man shouted that this would be his finishing blow, but George had already prepared a quick counterattack. With perfect precision, he drove a powerful punch into the man's chin. The impact sent the bodyguard flying, knocking him unconscious instantly. Every woman in the room was stunned by George's overwhelming victory. Raising her hand, she declared George the winner of the match and their new bodyguard. Outside, everyone commented on how unbelievably strong he had been during the fight. And with that, George took the first big step on his new journey in the district. Now, dressed in his new outfit, he complained that it was difficult to move around in it. Just then, one of the women approached him from behind, catching him by surprise. She giggled and said his tie was slightly crooked. As she straightened the knot, she began talking about the earlier fight. She then concluded that watching him fight had been thrilling. Stepping back, she remarked that there weren't many customers today. Turning to him with a smile, she invited him to a welcome party. Adjusting his tie, George simply looked at her with his usual serious expression. Everyone raised their glasses for the welcome celebration. Gathered together in the room, they all seemed to be enjoying the celebration. She asked if he didn't drink alcohol, and he replied that alcohol was poison. One of the women asked why. Kumika looked so grumpy during the party. Pouting, she complained that the celebration was supposed to be just for the two of them. Another woman said that falling in love with the bodyguard was absolutely forbidden there. Blushing, Kumika denied it, saying it wasn't like that at all. She then admitted that she felt strange whenever a strong man was nearby. Hearing that, John slammed her cup onto the table with a very serious expression. While eating a chicken drumstick, she seemed quite interested in the conversation. Looking at Kumika, she warned that if Kumika started a secret romance, she would report her. While eating sushi, she remarked that they could earn points for doing that. "That's a great deal," she said. Lady Suzu told her not to say such terrible things because they were teammates. One of the women asked how many points someone would earn for reporting a forbidden romance. Checking a scroll, John began searching for the information she requested. Surprised, she shouted that the reward was 20 points, an incredibly high amount. Furious, Kumika yelled that she wasn't dating him at all. John said that with 20 points, she could move up in rank within the district. Sitting at the table, George asked for an explanation. They told him that their ranks were determined by points. She continued, saying that the three of them were low-ranking courtesans known as Yuzubani. In contrast, Issei and Kumika held the higher rank of Oborizukyo. Lady Suzu explained that Issei was close to becoming one of the 4 highest-ranked courtesans. Kumika told her to stop, saying she didn't even want to hear about it. George then remarked that the city seemed obsessed with ranking everyone. Taking a sip of her drink, she confirmed that the district was a strict hierarchical society. George silently listened, taking in the new information. He asked whether reporting other people was another way to climb the ranks, and she confirmed that it was. Refilling her glass, she said some people tried to earn points by informing on others. George stood up from the table and quietly walked toward John. Standing behind her, he stared at her as she continued reading the scroll. His eyes widened as he prepared to snatch the scroll from her. In one swift motion, George suddenly snatched the paper from her hand. Startled and annoyed, she shouted, asking what he was doing since he was just a bodyguard. Reading the scroll, he found a rule worth 10 points and asked whether the rule stated that no one was allowed to leave the district. She confirmed it, saying that neither the courtesans nor the bodyguards were permitted to leave. With a grim expression, she revealed that the only way out was death. The other two remarked that at least they never had to worry about food. They said this place was like paradise because of all the privileges. Surrounded by food, they genuinely seemed to enjoy life in the district. George remarked that the place looked like paradise, but there had to be a catch. With a serious expression, he wondered if this was really just a prison. Shouting, John asked if there were any errand boys nearby. With a smile, Kyo appeared and replied that he had come as soon as she called. Everyone then ordered another round of drinks for the party. Interrupting them, George mentioned that the errand boys had been allowed through the gate today. She then confirmed that errand boys were the only exception to the rule. She invited Kyo to sit down and eat. Since it was George's welcome party, Kyo realized that Mikio was speaking to them as an equal. Looking up at the moon, the boy sighed, lost in thought. He told himself that Mikio had become someone from a world far beyond his reach. His stomach suddenly growled, reminding him how hungry he was. He said he wanted to eat Lady Yoshi's leftovers, but an old woman appeared and shouted that he wasn't allowed to do that. While smoking, she explained that the leftovers would be sold to the slums. Annoyed, the boy told her to be quiet, but she scolded him instead. Suddenly, the door opened, and Mikio appeared, asking for Kyo. The boy ran over to him. He asked why Mikio was there, and George showed him the food he had brought. Seeing the feast of delicious dishes, the boy began to drool. He said Mikio really understood him, but the old woman shouted at him, warning him not to touch those leftovers. Pointing at Mikio, she said that man might report him for it. Frightened, the boy looked at Mikio, who simply watched the situation in silence. George then said he had no interest in reporting people or earning points. Handing over the food, he added that he wanted to ask Kyo for a favor in return. With a serious expression, the boy stared at him, carefully considering the request. The next day, the boy walked through the forest, pushing his cart. Looking exhausted, he seemed worn out from all the walking. Suddenly, he spotted someone in the distance and cried out in surprise. Waving his hand, he called to a woman hanging laundry. Turning around, the woman looked at him, puzzled by the boy's sudden shout. Running toward her, he asked if she was Rin. She let out a soft laugh. She said that thanks to him, Mikio had made it inside. Handing him a cup, she offered the surprised boy a drink of water. Amazed by the crystal-clear water, he said he had never seen anything like it. Sitting down, she said he needed to drink clean water and offered to teach him how to make it. She explained that all he had to do was boil and distill the water, which greatly impressed the boy. With a smile, she asked if Mikio was doing well. Excitedly, the boy told her that Mikio had become an exclusive bodyguard on his very first day. Smiling with satisfaction, she said she was happy to hear that. Suddenly, remembering something, the boy said Mikio had asked him to deliver a message. He handed her an envelope, saying Mikio wanted her to have it. Opening it, she read the message with a worried expression. In the letter, Mikio asked for information about a man named Kenjaki. Curious, the boy peeked over and asked if she was looking for that man. With a smile, the boy offered to pass the information along to Mikio. Closing her eyes, she seemed to consider the boy's proposal. With a serious expression, she said she couldn't trust him with it. Surprised and frustrated, the boy shouted, asking why she couldn't entrust the task to him. She explained that the district was sealed off, and if he were discovered, it would be extremely dangerous. Placing her hand on the envelope, she told him not to worry about it. She warned that, in the worst-case scenario, he could be killed for it. Terrified by the warning, the boy fell silent, staring at her. The scene then shifted to a flashback of their earlier meeting. That night, Mikio had asked the boy to deliver the letter to the doctor. With a smile, the boy said it would be an easy task. He told them to eat the food he had brought, but the old woman shouted, warning him not to eat those leftovers. Squatting down, he handed the food to both of them, and told them to keep quiet. He said it was hush money, to make sure they stayed silent about everything. Inside the box was a lavish feast filled with delicious dishes. With her eyes wide open, the old woman was stunned by the offer. Gritting her teeth, she struggled against the temptation, but in the end, she gave in and began devouring the feast. Thanking him, they both ate desperately, grateful for the meal they had been given. With his mouth full of food, the boy smiled, happy to finally have a full stomach. Back at the clinic, the boy looked thoughtful after finishing his meal. Clutching the bag tightly, he seemed to have made an important decision. He told the doctor everything. He said Mikio had lied to him. She simply looked at him, curious to hear the rest of the story. Angrily, the boy told her that Mikio had said he was going to buy a woman. He admitted he had almost started to hate Mikio because of that lie, but he also said he was glad that Mikio was there to help everyone. With determination in his eyes, the boy shouted that he wanted to help Mikio. She simply looked at him, surprised by the boy's enthusiasm. Quietly, he said that Mikio couldn't accomplish anything without his help. Letting out a sigh, she finally seemed to agree with what the boy was saying. Smiling, they commented that Mikio had been acting strangely lately. With a smile, the boy told her to tell him everything without worrying. Closing her eyes, she finally agreed to trust the boy. With a serious expression, she began talking about the man named Kenzaki. She explained that he might be using a different name and a different face. In despair, the boy shouted that they would never be able to find him then. Sitting down, she said Kenzaki had one unique characteristic, and with a serious expression, she explained that it was something he could never change. The boy stared at her, carefully listening to every word she said. Meanwhile, back in the flower district, life continued as usual. George noticed customers arriving from outside the island to visit the district. Lady Yoshi remarked that the place was surprisingly peaceful at the moment. That made George think there had to be some way to enter and leave the island, but he replied that such a thing seemed impossible. After all, this was a mission for him. Laughing at how serious he was, she called him far too rigid. She mentioned that he had started work a little late that day. Looking up at the balcony, he saw that everyone else had already begun their day. She explained that those who worked in the morning were the ones with the fewest points. Suddenly, Lady Suzu called out to a man named Fujinaga. Waving at him, she asked if he was free today. Looking awkward, he replied, maybe next time, and quickly avoided her. Shocked by the rejection, she quietly watched him walk away. George remarked that she looked rather desperate, and guessed they must have quotas to meet. With a smile, Yoshi said that one day he would understand how everything worked. Stepping closer, she asked whether Kyo had enjoyed the leftovers he received. George asked what she was talking about, and she replied that she already knew. With a sly smile, she asked what he was secretly planning. Without saying a word, he simply stared at her with his usual serious expression. He then told her not to make baseless accusations. Turning away, she said she wouldn't report him, but told him to remember one thing. Pointing at him, she warned that he now owed her a favor. Completely unfazed, he asked what her real objective was. She replied that when the time came, all he had to do was stand by her side. George silently watched her, processing the proposal she had just made. Suddenly, a voice called out to her, interrupting their conversation. A man wearing a hat approached with a smile and greeted her. He asked how she had been, and whether she had been taking good care of her health. Removing his hat, he asked if there had been any changes in her condition. Calling him Dr. Moroi, she replied that she was doing just fine. With a smile, The doctor said that all of the women were his patients. He explained that he needed to examine both their physical and mental health. Noticing Mikio, he said he didn't recognize that face. She introduced him as Mikio, the Camellia Group's new exclusive bodyguard. Introducing the doctor, she explained that he performed regular checkups for the courtesans. However, she found it strange and asked whether the health checkups weren't usually held at a different time. The doctor explained that he had come because of the condition of the district's chairman. Concerned, she asked if the chairman was all right, and he confirmed that he was. Suddenly, the doctor seemed to notice something and turned toward Mikio, looking at his crutch. He asked if George had broken a bone. George replied that it was only a fairly deep cut, nothing serious. Resting a hand on his chin, the doctor said it was serious and could become infected. Offering to help, he wanted to examine the wound, but Mikio refused. The doctor warned him not to underestimate the injury. Still insisting on helping, he crouched down and tried to disinfect the wound. But George stopped him. With a serious expression, Mikio prepared to make a swift and decisive move. To everyone's surprise, he struck the doctor, sending him flying backward in a spinning motion. The doctor was knocked into the air, his gloves flying off. Caught completely off guard, everyone on the street was stunned by what they had just witnessed. Completely confused, the boy asked what all of this meant. She then revealed that the man they were looking for had a prosthetic arm. The boy's eyes widened in shock at the revelation. She explained that the man was missing everything, below his elbow. She went on to say that no matter how much he changed his appearance, a missing arm would never grow back. The boy silently absorbed the information. Back at the scene, the doctor's young assistant rushed in to attack. With a focused gaze, Mikio prepared to face his new opponent. He darted to the side, dodging the young man's attack. With sharp eyes, he realized something important during the confrontation. The young assistant attacked at incredible speed, but George stood perfectly still, watching the strike. Rushed toward him. Using his crutch, he blocked the blade's attack with flawless precision. Astonished by the sight, she could only watch the battle unfold before her. With tremendous strength, George gripped his crutch firmly and maintained his defensive stance against the attack. Shocked that his strike had been blocked, the assistant stared at George, unable to believe what had just happened. The doctor shouted an order, telling his assistant to stop attacking immediately. Then Hay disarmed the young man, bringing the confrontation between the two to an end. Stepping back, the doctor looked relieved that a tragedy had been avoided. With a serious expression, George simply observed everything in silence. Apologetically, the doctor said his assistant had not been properly trained. He also apologized for trying to treat George's injury so abruptly earlier. In a concerned tone, he explained that deep wounds could easily become infected. Adjusting his prosthetic arm, he said he understood what it felt like to lose a limb. With a snap of his fingers, he remarked that living like this was quite inconvenient. George simply stared silently at the doctor, showing no reaction. Scolding his assistant, the doctor said he had not forgiven the young man's reckless actions. He then told the young man that George was not the one who should be receiving an apology. The young assistant silently accepted the reprimand. Lowering his head, he sincerely apologized for his reckless behavior. With a dark expression, George thought to himself that he had nearly killed him. Still wearing a stern expression, he glared at the assistant, carefully assessing the situation. The doctor then apologized to George for his assistant's behavior. Calling for Roku, he said it was time to leave, and the young man obeyed. Concerned, she asked George if he was all right after all the chaos. Holding his crutch, he assured her that he was fine. Then he noticed that his crutch had been broken during the fight. With a gloomy expression, he examined the broken piece of wood in his hand. That night, he sat on the rooftop, gazing at the full moon. Closing his eyes, he sank deep into his memories, concentrating intensely. In his mind, he saw himself walking toward the young assistant. The two of them stared at each other as if preparing for a duel. The tension was palpable, as though a battle was inevitable. With a leap, George charged at the young man, who merely stood there watching him. He launched a powerful frontal attack, but suddenly the young man appeared wearing glasses with a completely different expression. In his mind, George imagined himself blocking the first strike, only for his opponent to counterattack. Because of his injured leg, he stumbled. Spotting the opening, the young man lunged forward with his sword in a direct assault. His opponent followed with a spinning slash, knocking George aside. He managed to dodge, but the attack shattered his crutch. His face drenched in sweat, he cried out in pain from the impact. Then, to his surprise, he saw his opponent leap into the air for another attack. But George judged that the movement was too slow to be effective. Breaking into a cold sweat, he realized he was at a tremendous disadvantage. The assistant unleashed his finishing strike, landing it squarely in George's chest. With a cry, George saw himself being completely overwhelmed by his opponent's assault. Sitting on the rooftop, he noted that he had lost again. The score was now 57 wins to 7 losses. He continued, simulating every possible attack and defense. Inside his mind, with his injured leg, he estimated he was operating at only 40% of his normal ability. Even so, he kept running the simulations, predicting every move his enemy might make. He continued, the mental battle, taking countless imaginary blows. This endless repetition was a crucial part of his military training. In real combat, it allowed him to anticipate and react to enemy attacks. This ability had dramatically increased his combat IQ on the battlefield. He recalled just how powerful the assistant had seemed in the simulations. Having a win rate below 10% was a first for him. The assistant was only 12 years old, and George wondered how that was even possible. He questioned whether that incredible speed was really attainable. Suddenly, a voice rang out, pulling him from his deep thoughts. Looking back, he saw Kyo approaching and asking what was wrong. With a smile, Kyo said he had finally understood the clue about the prosthetic arm. He revealed that he had identified Kenjaki. It seemed George would soon have a chance to confront him. Completely confused, the boy asked what was going on with him. With a smile, George told Kyo that he had identified his target, thanks to him. The boy beamed with pride at the compliment. Patting George on the back, Kyo said that flattering him wouldn't get George anywhere. Walking down the hallway, George asked Kyo to keep their conversation a secret. Suddenly stopping, he seemed to catch an unusual scent in the air. With a puzzled expression, he looked ahead, trying to figure out what it was. Entering the room, he saw 2 women who looked terribly weak. Kusuzu was crying while Kumika held her in her arms, trying to comfort her. George silently watched them, unsure what to do. As they stepped into the room, George and Kyo came across the scene. The boy grabbed George's leg, shouting to get his attention. George asked what was wrong, and the boy yelled at him not to say that. Pointing at the 2 young women, he warned that Lady Suzu was crying. George's only response was, "So what?" forcing the boy to question him. Shouting at George, the boy said people were supposed to pretend they didn't notice someone crying. He stressed that every man had to remember that important rule. From a distance, George simply watched the 2 women talking on the sofa. Meanwhile, the young woman mentioned something about the monthly evaluation meeting. Still in tears, the other woman asked what she meant. She then said that no one could ever be allowed to find out. Her friend told her to stay calm, assuring her that no one would notice anything. After a long silence, she insisted that only the 2 of them knew about it. She then asked if that was true. Looking directly at the other girl with tear-filled eyes, the young woman remained silent, unable to answer. Under the moonlight, a message confirmed that the final payment had been completed. Pinning the customer to the ground, he thanked her, saying her service had been very satisfying. He watched the customer leave with the girl, who thanked him once more. The customer promised he would return, and the girl replied that she would be waiting. Letting out a sigh, she closed her eyes for a moment. Suddenly, a coworker approached from behind and praised her. Getting her attention, Ise remarked that it was already her 4th room of the day, which would help with the monthly evaluation. Clenching her fist, she promised to do her best as Ise's fellow teammate. Her friend then reminded her not to overwork herself. Across the street, the man's companions called for him, and he finally left on his own. George began to understand how all of this was connected to the monthly evaluation. As time passed, the flower district gradually changed. The streets became far busier, with crowds moving through the area. The next day, 2 birds perched on a tree branch. On the rooftop, George sat cross-legged in a meditative posture. Suddenly, he opened his eyes and focused intently on something ahead. Placing his hands on his knees, he began to rise. With incredible speed, he launched a powerful strike before landing back on the rooftop. He spun around and followed with a second devastating attack. Startled by the noise, the birds on the branch flew away. Now, standing upright, he examined the inner workings of his mechanical leg. After testing its movement, a faint smile appeared on his face. In the next scene, a large gate was struck repeatedly with a heavy mallet. Holding the mallet, a man prepared to make an important announcement. He shouted that the monthly evaluation meeting was finally about to begin. In front of the stage, a crowd of women silently watched. A scoreboard displaying the rules and penalties, including the punishment for finishing last. Below the stage, all the participants looked up at the board with serious expressions. It symbolized the district's rigid hierarchy. This meeting would decide their future. Finally, the announcer declared the arrival of the long-awaited great chairwoman. Stepping forward, the chairwoman began making her way to the front. Without the slightest ceremony, she stepped on the back of a man serving as a human staircase. Continuing onward, she climbed a staircase made of people stacked like a pyramid. She advanced toward her podium. From a distance, George watched the entire spectacle with a serious expression. Suddenly, she stumbled in the middle of her walk, completely losing her balance. She pitched forward unexpectedly, but a hand caught hers and stopped her fall. Immediately, 2 bodyguards helped her to her feet and asked if she was hurt. With a smile, she replied that they were truly dependable. Then, one of the bodyguards charged at the man who had caused her to stumble. Without any hesitation, he drove a straight punch into the subordinate's face. Collapsed on the ground, the man writhed in pain after the brutal blow. Standing still, the bodyguard and his companions watched the aftermath of the attack. At last, the chairwoman reached the podium. Escorted by her bodyguards, one of them knelt on the stage and held up a megaphone for her. Using the megaphone, she addressed the massive crowd of women. She went on to say that customers came because of their hard work and dignity. Grateful, the women below the stage began applauding her. With a smile, she declared that simply being alive was already a victory. Her tone changed, and she admitted that she disliked holding these meetings, but explained that competition was what maintained the district standards. She said they could not thrive without proper competition. With a sinister smile, she asked who would end up in last place. Her words were followed by a tense silence throughout the crowd. A loud knock echoed at the gate. The man shouted for everyone to line up immediately. In response, a group of men hurried over and formed ranks as ordered. They all took their positions in complete silence, awaiting the next command. George watched their movements with a focused expression. The women also turned around, clearly anxious about what was happening. Suddenly, a man wearing a hat emerged, walking through the crowd, accompanied by his assistant. He adjusted his glasses as he surveyed the scene. Looking over the crowd, he said it was time to begin. The announcer then shouted that it was time to reveal the results. He raised his drumsticks and struck the drum with tremendous force. With both drumsticks, he pounded the drum as hard as he could. The chairwoman announced that the top sales champion was EOC. Immediately, her name appeared at the top of the event's main scoreboard. One of her coworkers remarked that she was as amazing as everyone had expected. Accepting the congratulations, EOC simply thanked her coworker for the recognition. Commenting on the results, one of her friends said EOC would surely become one of the Supreme Four. Bursting into tears, she said that living alongside Ire had been the greatest treasure of her life. Announcing second place, the chairwoman called Mio's name through the megaphone. Kumika congratulated Ire on her remarkable victory. Surprised by the gesture, Ire remarked that it was rare to hear congratulations from Kumika. In response, Kumika told her not to act as though she were some heartless villain. She said that at the very least, she could still offer her congratulations. Then EOC apologized. She mentioned that the Supreme Four would each receive their own mansion. She admitted that EOC had always been a nuisance, but acknowledged that with her departure, things would feel a little lonelier. Hearing the remark, EOC smiled before announcing third place over the loudspeaker. The chairwoman declared that third place belonged to Kumika. Beaming with joy, Kumika celebrated the news she had just received. To congratulate her, EOC gave her coworker a hearty slap on the back. Wincing in pain, Kumika asked EOC not to hit so hard. EOC apologized, explaining that she had gotten too excited and used too much force. Turning to the others, she asked them to take good care of Pawn. The chairwoman then announced 10th place, keeping the atmosphere lively. But as they reached the halfway point, silence gradually fell over the crowd. The district was considered a true paradise, which made the thought of being expelled terrifying. With sweat running down her face, the young woman anxiously waited for the final rankings to be announced. For all of them, expulsion was essentially a death sentence. For those whose names had not yet been called, the pressure of elimination only continued to grow. The chairwoman then prepared to announce 22nd place. She called out John's name, and her rival celebrated the result. In disbelief, John complained that she had lost to that frail little girl. The other woman replied that her alluring figure had its own loyal clientele. Shortly afterward, Pawn was announced as the 23rd place finisher. Seeing her reaction, Suzu asked if she was actually happy despite losing. Her friend walked over and told her not to worry. IOC said she already had customers and there was no way she would finish in last place. But the chairwoman announced that, since she was bored, she would reveal everything at once. On the board, Suzu appeared in 30th place, barely avoiding last place. Letting out a sigh of relief, she prepared to continue her life in the district as usual. With a smile, the chairwoman concluded the revenue rankings. Then, she warned everyone that those were only the preliminary results, mentioning an evaluation report. She began explaining the bonus and penalty points. She announced that the rankings would be completely reshuffled. At that moment, a loud knock echoed at the gate. The announcer shouted that these were the real results. The scoreboard then began updating every ranking and name. The last two positions flashed, and IOC watched in complete confusion. Her rivals were equally bewildered, wondering what was happening. Names began filling in the middle of the rankings. Finally, Suzu's name appeared in last place on the board. She was completely stunned. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Whispers spread through the crowd, as the women wondered what Suzu could possibly have done. On the stage, the chairwoman asked why the announcer had suddenly gone silent. She ordered him to liven up the event, or he wouldn't be doing his job properly. Caught off guard by the order, the man froze for a brief moment. Then he shouted into the microphone, announcing the shocking upset involving last place. While Suzu was still in shock, Doa found the entire situation unbearably dull. Clicking her tongue in annoyance, she made her displeasure obvious. Interrupting everyone, she asked the chairwoman for permission to ask a question. In response, the chairwoman praised Doa for working hard throughout the month. Defending her friend, Doa asked exactly what rule Suzu had broken. With a smile, the chairwoman called Doa a cruel woman as well. She asked whether Doa truly wanted that shameful violation to be exposed right there. Refusing to back down, Doa shouted that it wasn't her intention. Granting the request, the chairwoman said that humiliation was part of the punishment. She ordered the announcer to read Rule 23 of the district's code. Raising his voice, he explained that the rule forbade sleeping with customers. Ignoring the murmurs from the crowd, he added that everyone already knew this rule. The chairwoman then asked the young woman whether she fully understood that rule. Stammering, Suzu couldn't answer, and Doa asked her what she had done. The chairwoman explained that this district was no ordinary place. Describing the district, she called it a playground for wealthy executives, insisting that they did not do business with ordinary customers. Amid the crowd, George simply watched the exchange unfold. When she asked what gave the district its value, she answered it herself. Its value lay in being unattainable. Using a metaphor, she spoke of a luxury handbag going on sale. According to her, no man would pay a premium for a woman who gave in too easily. By teasing without giving satisfaction, they increased their own value. Even so, she said that the woman in last place had slept with a first-time customer. Sobbing, Suzu could not deny the chairwoman's accusation. Faced with her confession, the other women all turned to look at her. Turning to her friends, she said she loved this city and this group. She explained that this love terrified her at the thought of being expelled. With her face obscured, her rival could only watch the scene from afar. Through tears, Suzu said she couldn't attract customers, and even the few she had eventually left. In a flashback, a man pressed a knife to her face and threatened her. Desperate, she begged for one more chance, promising she would never do it again. Over the loudspeaker, the chairwoman asked if she was an idiot. She said they had dressed her up, turning her into a valuable brand, yet she had devalued herself. It was a foolish and thoughtless act. With undisguised contempt, the chairwoman declared that she was nothing but trash. Suzu stood frozen in tears at the cruel words. The chairwoman then thanked the person who had submitted the report exposing the violation. Among the crowd, one young woman noticed something strange on the scoreboard. Calling to her friend, she said something terrible was happening. The scoreboard suddenly began shifting and updating the rankings once again. Kumika's name rose to the top of the rankings. Turning to her coworker, EOC said she couldn't believe it was Kumika. With a smile, Kumika spoke up to defend herself. She said that rules were rules, and she couldn't simply ignore the situation. Grabbing Kumika by the collar, EOC shouted, asking how she could do something like this. Kneeling on the floor, Suzu couldn't believe what had just happened. In a flashback, she recalled her conversation with Kumika that night. Kumika had encouraged her to sleep with a customer as soon as possible. Through tears, she asked whether Kumika had deceived her and orchestrated everything. With a smile, Kumika said she had no idea what Suzu was talking about. On the stage, the chairwoman praised the whistleblower for protecting the district's dignity. She congratulated Kumika, who had been promoted to the ranks of the Supreme Four because of it. With a satisfied smile, Kumika asked for a round of applause. Below the stage, the women clapped, saying Suzu deserved her punishment. Grabbing her co-worker's clothes, Doa glared at Kumika with pure rage. In response to the provocation, Kumika slapped Doa hard across the face. Looking down at her, she declared that she was now one of the Supreme Four. Shouting in anger, she ordered IOC not to lay a hand on her. She called her a lowly nobody. Surrounded by the others, Kumika declared that heaven always sees the truth. With a wink, she said justice always prevails. Or at least, that's what people say. As night fell, the flower district finally became a little quieter. Inside one of the rooms, several groups gathered in their own corners. Sitting on the sofa, one of them commented on how unusually quiet the Camellia group had become after the evaluation meeting ended. George remained silent with a serious expression. The difference in treatment between the whistleblower and the rule-breaker couldn't have been more obvious. As the whistleblower, Kumika stepped into a luxurious carriage, while the offender was dragged toward the gate by the guards. Her face twisted in pain as she was taken out of the district. Aok and her co-workers could only watch the scene unfold from afar. Back in the room, EOC let out a heavy sigh. One of the girls lying on the sofa said she had completely lost her motivation. She still couldn't understand what Kusuzu had been thinking when she did something like that. Sitting alone at the table, EOC downed an entire glass of liquor in one gulp. She slammed the glass onto the table, spilling some of the drink. At that moment, George walked over and told her to stop drinking and get some sleep. Raising her glass, she said things weren't that simple. She reminded him that he was supposed to guard the place until she fell asleep. Without even looking at her, George simply told her to do whatever she wanted. Sitting on the floor, he remarked that drunks were a nuisance in every world. Quietly, she stared at him for a moment before speaking again. She said that in this city, people who turned others in were praised as great heroes. Furious, she shouted that everyone blamed Suzu but said nothing about Kumika. Slamming her fist on the table, she declared that the whole situation was completely messed up. George explained that discipline was the foundation of any organization. She agreed, but said treating snitching as an achievement was wrong. George then asked if she was only angry because she had lost the top spot. Setting her glass down, she seemed even more irritated and turned away. She warned him that she wasn't in the mood for jokes. Closing his eyes, George apologized for his poor choice of words. She exhaled a puff of smoke and began talking about the island. She said the courtesans living in the flower district lacked for nothing. Refilling her glass, she asked whether he saw this city as a paradise. George replied that everyone had told him this place was paradise. Because of that, he had assumed it was exactly as it appeared. She scoffed at his answer. She said they were under constant surveillance. She explained that they were all forced to live between the fear of being expelled and the hope of promotion. She called it selling their souls. To her, that so-called happiness was nothing but an illusion. Listening intently, George kept his eyes fixed on her. He added that they were being deceived into working there for the rest of their lives. According to her, all of this was orchestrated by Lady Kikyo, the chairwoman of the district. As George reflected on her words, he wondered what that woman was hiding. Beneath that smile, behind it lay cruelty and an insatiable desire for control. He asked if the chairwoman herself had created the entire system. Glancing to the side, she remarked that he caught on quickly. Turning her back to him, EOC insisted that Lady Kikyo was terrifying. She shouted that the chairwoman saw them as nothing more than livestock. George silently listened as she vented her anger. Suddenly, Kyo came running in, shouting that he had gathered a great deal of important information. Rushing past EOC, he ran straight to George. Confused, she asked what he meant by important information. Only then did Kyo notice her presence and panic. He quickly covered his mouth. Clicking his tongue in mild annoyance, George watched the scene unfold. EOC then asked Kyo exactly what the information was about. Stammering, the boy couldn't answer and had no idea what to do. Walking around the table, she asked him again what he meant by information. With trembling hands, the boy stuttered, unable to answer. Grabbing his face, she ordered him to tell her immediately. Trying to break free, he refused, saying he couldn't reveal a single word. He shouted that he could never betray Mikio's trust. From a distance, George wondered whether the boy was actually that foolish. Kyo then shouted that he would rather die than betray his master. Faced with his refusal, she asked whether he remembered the rules of this place. The boy replied that he had learned them well. Risking everything just to earn a place in this district, the boy confidently said he could recite every single rule from memory. She picked up her fan and challenged him to recite Rule 3. Caught completely off guard, the boy fell silent for a moment. He then recited the rule forbidding anyone from disobeying their superiors in the chain of command. With a smile, she patted him on the head and congratulated him. She reminded him that the rules forbade him from disobeying her. She then accused him of trying to defy her orders, calling it a serious offense. Waving her fan, She threatened to report him to the district authorities. Terrified by the threat, the boy could only nod. Breaking into a cold sweat, George thought back to what she had said earlier. Holding up 2 fingers, she said she would give him 2 choices. The first was to keep his mouth shut and face the consequences, which meant being expelled. The horrified boy shook his head. With a smile, she said she wasn't a devil, and offered him another option. She asked him to tell her everything, no matter what the information was. As a reward, she promised not to report either him or his master. Grateful, the boy praised EOC for her incredible kindness toward them. After repeating himself several times, he asked if he could finally share the information. Watching the scene, George realized just how easily the boy could be manipulated. Beginning to speak, Kyo explained that he had followed the rule breaker. After the evaluation meeting, speaking loudly, EOC quickly told him to keep his voice down so no one would overhear. She asked whether George had been the one who gave the order, and he confirmed it. Then he asked whether she was curious about the fate of those who were expelled. Because of that, he believed, there had to be something important at the place they were taken. She agreed, and mentioned the rumors about human experiments on the courtesans who had been expelled. George wondered whether they were taken to some kind of processing facility, or simply removed from the island forever. Turning to Kyo, she asked where Suzu had been taken. The boy then revealed that Lady Suzu had never actually been expelled. Stunned by the revelation, the 2 of them asked him to repeat what he had just said. Grabbing the boy, she demanded to know where Suzu was, but he told her to calm down, and began explaining. He said that the men in suits had taken Suzu away. In a flashback, he had followed them from a distance. Running across the rooftops, he watched as they stopped at a gate while the guards checked that the area was secure. Then, the sight he witnessed left him completely frozen. Instead of leaving, they simply turned back and headed toward the eastern wall. She asked the boy again, pointing out that the eastern wall was a dead end. With a serious expression, the boy insisted that Suzu had entered a building in the alley. Completely baffled, EOC's face filled with surprise. Turning away, she said what he described was impossible. George told her not to overreact, and simply answer what building it was. With a worried expression, she said there was only one clinic there. She then revealed that it belonged to the famous doctor, Murray. Surprised, George asked if she was certain. He began thinking about the whereabouts of the supposedly expelled woman. With this revelation, a new suspicion formed in his mind about what might have happened. With a faint smile, he began to understand the entire situation more clearly. The expelled woman had been taken into the care of Dr. Murray. Standing up, EOC left the room, and the boy asked where she was going. Hearing that, George stood up as well, and the boy asked what he was doing. Turning to Kyo, George ordered him not to follow. Startled by the command, the boy had no idea how to respond. Ignoring George, Kyo followed him down the hallway, calling out to him. George turned around and explained that a fight might break out where they were headed. Outside, the 2 of them walked side by side through the dark corridor. She asked what he wanted and where he thought he was going. Quietly, she stared at him with a serious and suspicious look. With an equally serious expression, George insisted on knowing where she was going. He told her to go back and get some sleep. She replied that she couldn't do that. George then reminded her that his duty was to protect his assigned courtesan. Turning away, she said nothing, but seemed to accept him accompanying her. Without another word, the 2 continued walking side by side. Arriving at the clinic, she said they had reached their destination. In front of Dr. Murray's clinic, a sign indicated that it was closed. Letting out a sigh, she prepared to call for someone inside. Knocking on the door, she shouted the doctor's name and demanded that they open up. Resting a hand against the doorframe, she stubbornly continued calling for the doctor. Suddenly, the front door slowly creaked open, breaking the silence. From inside, a pair of eyes stared directly at them. A young assistant asked what they wanted at this hour. She immediately said she was feeling very sick and wanted to see the doctor. The assistant told them to leave. He warned that the doctor was resting. Rejected, she hesitated, unsure of what to say. Raising a hand to her mouth, she insisted that she truly felt terrible. Suddenly, George's gaze shifted to the clinic's second floor. Then he carefully observed the upper level of the building for a while. Unable to understand what he was looking at, she turned her attention back to the assistant. Looking her over, the young man said she appeared perfectly healthy. She refused to accept the assistant's refusal. Then she shoved him aside, saying he knew nothing. Remaining calm, the assistant warned that the area was off limits to anyone who wasn't a patient. Standing at the doorway, she received another warning from the clinic's young assistant. He said that if she took one more step, they would use force. Startled by the threat, she took a step back and looked at him. Suddenly, her bodyguard scooped her into his arms and apologized for the disturbance. Struggling to break free, she shouted. But George reminded her that the doctor was resting. He carried her away as she yelled for him to put her down. Holding her close, he whispered that she should listen without reacting. He then revealed that the building was equipped with numerous surveillance cameras. Startled, she asked him to repeat himself, and he said he had counted 18 of them. Still in his arms, she asked why a clinic would need so many cameras. George replied that it either contained a treasure or was hiding a major secret. Hearing that theory, she silently processed the information. Looking back at the clinic, George began analyzing the situation more carefully. Reflecting on everything he had seen, he concluded that the clinic was hiding a secret. He then said they didn't have enough information to make a move yet. Meanwhile, the young assistant watched them from inside the darkened clinic. In silence, George also realized that this wasn't the right time to act. Carrying her in his arms, he wondered what their next move should be. Scene change. 3 days had passed since the monthly evaluation. With a finger resting against her lips, Doa seemed to be assessing the person before her. Kneeling before her was a young woman. She was told that her appearance was well suited for this place. With her fan in hand, Doa announced that the woman had passed the evaluation. Calling her by name, Rina, she prepared to deliver the final verdict. With a smile, Doa declared that from that day forward, she was a courtesan. Wearing a stunned expression, the young woman seemed unable to grasp what was happening. Flashback to 3 days earlier. The three of them sat around a table discussing their visit to the clinic. All three remained silent, reflecting on the events of that day. Wondering why there were so many cameras, she tried to uncover the clinic's secret. George then stated that Jin's true target was undoubtedly the doctor. For some reason, the doctor maintained the clinic to conceal something, a secret that absolutely no one was allowed to discover. Breaking the silence, Kyo tried to say something to the two of them. Seeing how quiet they were, he tried to lighten the mood. An idea suddenly struck him. He asked who would replace Kumika and Lady Suzu in the district. Surprised by the question, she looked over at the boy. Meanwhile, the boy mentioned that the district authorities would fill the vacant positions. She asked where exactly the replacements would come from. He replied that they could come from outside the island, through a specific route. Surprised by the answer, George repeated that they came from outside. Standing up, he asked whether she and the others had also come from somewhere else. With an irritated expression, she warned him that investigating someone's past was taboo. She declared that no one there truly knew about her past. What's more, she knew nothing about John's or Paul's past either. Hearing that, George simply remarked that the situation was complicated. Standing up, she said she was tired and went to bed. The boy admitted that he was worried about the arrival of the newcomers. He then asked whether she could refuse the people, the authorities, sent to her. Placing a hand on her chest, she replied that the final decision was hers to make. At that revelation, George's eyes lit up. He then asked whether he could bring a candidate for her to evaluate. She said yes, but added that there were no suitable women left on the island. Opening her fan, she boasted that her selection standards were extremely strict. With a smile, Kyo looked at George, and George simply nodded in confirmation. Smirking, he said they only needed to mention an emergency patient. Startled, Kyo immediately understood the plan and stood there in shock. Back to the present, Doa informed the female doctor that she was now officially a courtesan. Confused, the doctor looked around in bewilderment. Still kneeling, she begged them not to do this. Rejecting their offer, she declared that she had no intention of becoming a courtesan. It was all a lie. She asked about the emergency patient they had mentioned, only to discover that no such patient existed. The truth left her completely stunned. Turning to the two women, Doa ordered them to teach the newcomer everything. Faced with the order, the woman stood frozen, unable to react. She then turned back and glared at George in anger. The woman shouted that she had been tricked. Kneeling on the floor, Kyo repeatedly apologized to the female doctor. Grabbing George by the shirt, she asked if he was the one who had orchestrated everything. Straightening his collar, George admitted that the situation was indeed rather unusual. She recalled how Kyo had announced the emergency in such a flat, emotionless voice. On the way there, he had apologized so many times that she had genuinely started worrying about him. Placing a hand on her head, she said she had never imagined George would lie to her. Pointing at him, she accused him of using a child to deceive her. George then revealed that her target, Kenjaki, was in this very city. Shocked by the revelation, she stood frozen with her eyes wide open. He then warned her that the next day would be her chance to find him. With a determined expression, she firmly accepted his proposal. The following day, the doctor and his assistant arrived to conduct medical examinations. A woman greeted him at the door and asked how he was doing. Hidden nearby, George and the others watched the scene, but they were too far away to see clearly. After the monthly evaluation had ended, George had promised that an opportunity would come for her. With a determined look, she agreed and patiently waited for the right moment. The doctor then knocked on another door, announcing that he had come for the examination and was welcomed inside. He entered the room to begin the checkup. At the entrance, a newly appointed courtesan was waiting for him. She said it was an honor to meet him. With a wink, she introduced herself as Rinko, the district's newest courtesan. Hearing the introduction, the doctor simply remarked that she was new here. After asking for permission to enter, she mentioned that this had once been Lady Suzu's room. Removing his hat, he introduced himself as Dr. Moroi of the Flower District. The moment she heard his name, she froze completely, unable to move. Carefully analyzing every detail of his face, she had to be absolutely certain of his identity. Sweat began to pour down her face. She continued, staring at him without saying a word. Finally, she confirmed that the man standing before her was her target, Kenyaki. Kneeling down, she said she felt relieved to see such a kind doctor. Smiling beneath her mask, she admitted that she had wanted to find him for a very long time. Pulling out a dagger, she revealed that she had wanted to kill him for a very, very long time. Tightening her grip on the weapon, she prepared to strike. In a flashback, George warned her never to kill her target. He explained that the doctor's assistant would likely kill her immediately afterward. For that reason, he told her not to attempt the assassination if she wanted the mission to succeed. He even insisted that the time to kill him had not yet come. Back in the present, she withdrew her hand and put the dagger away. Noticing her expression, the doctor asked if something was wrong. She replied that she was fine and asked him to continue the examination. Putting on his stethoscope, he asked whether she had been eating well. Continuing the checkup, he asked if she had been sleeping well. He then asked whether she had any history of illnesses or surgeries. After that, he asked whether she was taking any medication or if her parents had any medical conditions. He inquired about hereditary diseases and also wanted to know whether she caught colds frequently. He continued the examination, asking about high fevers and other illnesses. After finishing the questionnaire, he said he understood and smiled at her while holding his clipboard. He remarked that all of her organs and bodily systems were in excellent condition. With a strange look in his eyes, he remarked that her body had always been like this. In her thoughts, she confirmed that her body had indeed always been this way. In a flashback, she recalled working in the war-torn regions, where wounded soldiers begged for death. One soldier said he couldn't endure the suffering any longer. Turning his back, the doctor merely sighed, calling it such a terrible waste. With a smile, he said that the soldier could become one of his experimental subjects. She immediately shouted, saying that no one should ever say something like that. Turning to her, he replied that the soldier was useless and could no longer serve any purpose. He then claimed that they could help advance science. Back in the present, she realized he had always viewed people as nothing more than test subjects. Looking at him, she wondered what he could possibly be planning there. Breaking the silence, he said he had forgotten to ask her age. Without hesitation, she replied that she was 28. Surprised, the doctor repeated her age, clearly finding it hard to believe. His reaction gave her a new suspicion about her target. As the examination came to an end, the doctor said there was nothing wrong with her health. Putting his hat back on, he said goodbye, and reminded her that he still had other patients to see. Calling for his assistant, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone. Watching him leave, she wondered whether he had lost interest because of her age. Staring into space, she began forming a new theory about Kenjaki. Sitting at the table, she heard George ask her to explain what she had discovered. She then said she needed to explain the abnormal nature of their target. Confused, George simply stared at her, waiting for the explanation she had promised. She reminded him that she had previously mentioned working for Doctors Without Borders. It was there, during one of her assignments, that she first met Kenjaki, who had come from Japan. At the time, only 3 people were part of the organization. The 3 were her, Kenjaki, and another man named Sasuma. Since they were all Japanese, they eventually became friends at the camp. But even back then, she remembered that Kenjaki had always been a little strange. At the time, she believed he was simply passionate about medicine. Lying before them was a patient strapped to a stretcher. Shocked, they asked what Kenjaki was doing to the patient. With a smile, he replied that he was testing a transplant procedure. Pointing at the leg, he said he had found a perfect one to transplant. Horrified, Sasuma asked if he even understood what he was doing. Kenjaki then explained that many soldiers left the battlefield after losing their limbs. Raising his voice, he declared that this would revolutionize battlefield medicine. Speechless, the two stared at the patient on the stretcher in disbelief. The patient then began to writhe and convulse violently on the stretcher. His eyes rolled back, and foam poured from his mouth as he completely lost control. Watching the horrifying scene, Kenjaki sighed about the immune rejection taking place. Without a hint of emotion, Sasuma ordered him to send the patient back to the battlefield. Quoting Thomas Edison, Kenjaki said there was no such thing as failure, only learning. With a gleam in his eyes, he seemed even more consumed by his obsession. Furious, Sasuma threw a punch straight into his colleague's face. Grabbing him by the collar, he declared that he would never allow such a surgery. He also pointed out that the leg belonged to an enemy soldier. Shouting in anger, he said it violated every principle of medical ethics. Still lying on the ground, Kenjaki replied that ethics only held progress back. Unable to understand, Sasuma asked what he was talking about. Kenjaki then asked whether medicine had advanced because of medical ethics. Staring directly at Sasuma, he prepared to continue his argument. Clenching his teeth, Sasuma could only glare back with burning rage in his eyes. After the incident, the outcome was fairly straightforward. For violating the rules, Kenjaki was sentenced to 14 days in solitary confinement. With a mosquito resting on his face, he simply stared silently at the cell's ceiling. But those 14 days pushed him to the very edge of sanity. Barefoot, he slowly walked down the prison corridor. At the time, they had volunteered to watch over Kenjaki because of a staff shortage. Sasuma believed that Kenjaki would learn from his mistakes and return to normal. Arriving at the cell, he told the prisoner it was time to eat. Suddenly, he stepped into a pool of blood on the cell floor. Looking inside, he was horrified by what he saw. Rushing to the door, he desperately tried to open it, shouting at Kenjaki and demanding to know what he had done. Unable to force the door open, he continued yelling for his fellow soldiers. The meal he had brought spilled all over the floor. Looking at the victim, Kenjaki sighed that the organs were fine, but the container was not. Holding up a scalpel, he said that, as body parts, they would serve his experiments well. Witnessing the scene, Sasuma called him a monster. His voice was filled with pure rage. With a smile, Kenjaki remarked that he had arrived at the perfect time. Without hesitation, he hurled a scalpel at his colleague, striking him in the neck. Sasuma clutched the wound, unable to comprehend Kenjaki's actions. Kenjaki then explained that he needed a subject to test his new surgical instruments. Grinning from ear to ear, he compared the situation to a patient bringing their own scalpel to surgery. Collapsing onto the floor, Sasuma tried to call Kenjaki's name before he died. When she arrived at the cell, she immediately realized that something terrible had happened inside. The remains of what had once been Sasuma were scattered across the floor. Horrified by the sight, she screamed, and after that, Kenjaki simply disappeared. Back in the present, George asked if that was why she was hunting him. After thinking for a moment, she said that might only be an excuse for herself. With a faint smile, she revealed that she wanted revenge for her fiancé's death. Hearing that revelation, George remained silent. He then asked what Kenjaki's objective was in that place. She explained that he was a mad scientist, obsessed with altering the human body. Because of that, there could only be one reason for him to hide there. Hearing her explanation, George understood the doctor's true ambition on the island. His only goal was to perfect his horrifying experiments on the human body. She concluded that the clinic undoubtedly concealed the doctor's darkest secrets. Suddenly, EOC turned around and realized someone had been eavesdropping. With her, fan in hand, she prepared to confront the listener. Walking over to the table, the woman said she had heard everything and had her own suspicions. With tears welling up in her eyes, the female doctor asked if she could ask one question. Pointing at her face, Doa asked about her smeared makeup. Then, she said she had been moved by the woman's determination. The doctor asked her to keep everything a secret, and Doa promised to help. Turning to her, Doa declared that she would support her mission. Surprised, neither of them had expected that reaction from a courtesan. Calling for George, she ordered him to infiltrate the clinic together with Rina. George then said that if the doctor was truly doing something illegal, they would act once they had proof. Doa affirmed that they could punish him under the district's laws. Kneeling on the floor, Rene shouted that such a punishment was far too lenient for him. Doa then reminded her that murder was forbidden under the district's rules. Placing a hand on her shoulder, Doa said that doctors were meant to keep people alive. She explained that killing him would make her no different from the man she despised. Frustrated, Rinnie merely clicked her tongue in response. Sitting in his chair, George said he agreed with most of the plan, but warned that he would kill the doctor if he believed it was necessary. Raising his hand, he said they had already gotten their hands dirty anyway. Then, he said he had already scouted the clinic, if nothing else. However, he reminded her that the place was covered by dozens of surveillance cameras. She offered to help, but George doubted her acting skills. Covering her mouth with one hand, she recalled her performance outside the clinic. Suddenly, Kyo ran over and caught Doa's attention. With a smile, he said he had brought the bottle of liquor she had requested. Handing the bottle to her, he was thanked for his help. She then popped the grand cap off the bottle with surprising ease. Without using a cup, she tilted the bottle back and drank straight from it. George asked what she was planning, while the female doctor looked on, completely confused, with her mouth hanging open. Doa admitted that she really wasn't good at acting. Watching the scene, the female doctor broke into a cold sweat, unable to understand what was happening. Then, George said she was about to become a genuinely drunk patient. Holding the bottle in her hand, Doa said she would lure them outside and was counting on him. Both the female doctor and George were stunned by the courtesan's boldness. Without warning, she ran toward the window, and without hesitation, leaped from the second floor. She crashed hard into one of the men in suits below, sending both of them tumbling onto the stone pavement. Startled by the loud crash, everyone rushed over to see what had happened. Collapsed on the ground, EOC writhed in pain as everyone recognized her. George then shouted for someone to call the doctor, and warned them not to touch her head. The female doctor said the situation was critical and that she needed immediate treatment. Clenching her fists, Renee understood the plan and prepared to act. Standing behind her, George asked whether she intended to waste EOC's determination. Then, he explained that the emergency would force everyone to leave the clinic. Once the target was gone, they would have the perfect chance to break in. Meanwhile, the doctor and his assistant finally arrived at the scene of the accident. Just then, Yoshi said to Rina, "Don't fail," and said she was counting on her. Outside the clinic, the two prepared to enter the building. As they rushed forward, George smashed the front door with his fist. One powerful punch shattered the wooden door and cleared the way. Worried about the noise, Renee remarked that he was being far too reckless. With the door open, George called to her and said they needed to move quickly. Sweating nervously, she stepped inside and began searching. Inside the clinic, they entered one of the rooms. George surveyed the dark, silent interior. With a serious expression, he found nothing out of the ordinary. Coming out from the back, Rina said there was only a storage room. George agreed that nothing seemed suspicious, but she found that hard to believe. Suddenly, George seemed to notice something, and his eyes widened. He immediately dropped to the floor, and she asked what was wrong. Pressing his ear against the ground, he remained silent. Lying there, he said he could hear a sound coming from below. Following the noise, he traced it to a spot beneath the examination table. Looking more closely, he discovered that the room contained a hidden basement. Beneath the examination table, a secret hatch led down below. Lighting their way, the two climbed down the long ladder into the basement. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a massive metal door. Without hesitation, George grabbed the handle and pulled it open. Inside, the two were met with a completely unexpected and horrifying sight. Meanwhile, outside, a crowd had gathered around EOC, who had collapsed on the ground. With blood trickling from her mouth, she groaned in pain. Unable to move, the doctor said she had broken something and that he would treat her on the spot. Lying on the stretcher, she thought this should buy them plenty of time. To herself, she blinked, silently signaling her teammates. Still lying on the ground, she wondered where her bodyguard had gone. The doctor approached her and asked if she was looking for someone. With a smile, he asked if she was looking for Roku. Startled, she stared at him, unsure how to answer his question. He then revealed that he had sent his assistant back to the clinic. Looking down from above, he said it hadn't looked like an accident. Shocked by that revelation, she stammered, unable to come up with an explanation. With a grim expression, he asked why she had deliberately jumped. Anxiously, she realized he knew something and silently warned the others to be careful. Back in the basement, the two braced themselves for what they were about to find. Moving deeper underground, they discovered an enormous hidden laboratory. Inside one of the containment chambers, a man wearing a breathing apparatus lay completely motionless. Horrified, she wondered if these were large-scale inhumane experiments. Clenching her teeth, she repeated the name, Kenjaki, with nothing but pure hatred. Furious, she punched the glass and screamed about how cruel he could be. Suddenly, she felt something touch her hand. On the laboratory floor, she turned around and saw a creature crawling toward her. Her eyes widened, and she screamed in horror at the sight. A humanoid creature crawled toward her, sobbing uncontrollably. With tears streaming down its face, it let out loud, heartbreaking cries. It crawled closer and stopped right in front of the two intruders. With a solemn expression, George said he understood what those people had been through. Kneeling down, he said the doctor had stripped them of their humanity, time and time again. Picking up a knife, he said he understood and prepared to act. Holding the knife, he promised to let them find peace at last. Suddenly, something struck the floor beside his hand. Turning around, he came face to face with the person who had thrown it. His eyes sharpened, as he prepared for the battle ahead. An instant later, something slashed across his face, leaving a cut on his cheek. From a distance, the doctor's assistant said he couldn't allow that. With blood running from the cut on his face, George continued staring at his opponent. The young man declared that he could not allow anyone to kill the doctor's test subjects. Grinding her teeth, Renee repeated the young man's words in disgust. Shouting in fury, she declared that they were real human beings. The assistant drew his sword and said he had to eliminate the intruders. Without hesitation, he charged toward her to strike with his blade. Sword in hand, he prepared to unleash a killing blow. Startled, she watched the attack rush toward her, unable to react. At that moment, George stepped in front of her and blocked the attack with his weapon, forcing the young man backward. George said he still hadn't found the two women. Shouting, he ordered Rennie to continue their mission. With a determined look, she nodded and prepared to run. Kicking the assistant aside, she yelled for her partner not to die. With his sword in hand, the young man declared that he would never let her pass. Thanks to the distraction, Rennie managed to run toward the back of the laboratory. Despite the wound on his face, George remained standing, calmly watching the battle unfold. Then he caught the young man's blade with his bare hand. Stunned, the assistant struggled in vain to pull his weapon free. At the same time, George hurled him aside, nearly knocking him off balance. The assistant managed to retreat and create some distance. He muttered that the situation had become troublesome and that he had to stop them. Then, he admitted that his speed couldn't match George's. Readying his weapon, the young man declared that he would finish George immediately. With a serious expression, George simply stared at his opponent, ready for battle. The two assumed their stances, preparing for the showdown. Bursting forward at incredible speed, the young assistant launched a head-on attack at his opponent. With unwavering focus, George carefully watched his opponent's movements without flinching. At the very last second, he blocked the incoming strike with his weapon. His attack having been stopped, the young assistant glared at George with a grim expression. Weapon at the ready, George prepared to launch his counterattack. He then slammed his foot into the ground, using the momentum to spin away defensively. He dodged the strike and created a small gap between them. George said that earlier, his leg during the fight hadn't been operating at full strength. Now he challenged the young man with his true maximum power. In response, the young assistant spat a tiny dart from his mouth.